A promising young life, Jessica Keene, a talented cheerleader, singer, and musician, had just begun dating her first boyfriend. But her bright future was tragically cut short when she encountered a monster. Today's case, I would like to introduce you to Jessica Lynn Keene. She was born to Rebecca and James Keene on September 24, 1975, in Columbus, Ohio. She had an older sister named Heather, who was born in 1971. Rebecca and James were doing all they could to give their daughters the very best life possible. James, who went by Jim was only 21 when they had Heather, and Rebecca was only 20. But Jim was ambitious. He was an entrepreneur from a very young age. It started with him having his own newspaper route when he was just a kid, and then he created his own miniature golf course in an empty lot near his home, and he cleverly sold the kids and neighborhood memberships so they could use it. When he was older, he was hired as a stock boy at Warehouse Paint Center, and in those days, many employees were very loyal to their jobs. So he worked his way up, and he was working there when he and Rebecca had their girls. He ended up staying there for 20 years and eventually became the president of the company. Rebecca was in school at Ostendorf Art Academy, studying fine arts and commercial art. And Jim was also very artistic himself. He enjoyed drawing and painting, so they had that in common. Rebecca was also working as a long-distance operator at Ohio Bell Telephone Company at the time. The family was living in Dayton, Ohio, and Rebecca also believed in being loyal to her employer, and she stayed with the company for nearly a decade. Then she began working for Time Warner Cable Company as a utility coordinator. Rebecca and Jim were both working parents, doing their best to make ends meet while raising two young girls and having fun. Jim enjoyed watching documentaries and playing golf. He loved watching Kentucky basketball, fishing, spending time kayaking with his family, and hanging with good friends. The family also enjoyed traveling together. Heather and Jessica were very close, being only a few years apart, and they did everything together. It was like having a built-in best friend growing up. They both attended Oakview Elementary School, where Jessica was an outstanding student. She was put into the Gifted Students program in 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. Tim Tudor, the gifted program coordinator at the time, said she just got an IQ in the mid-130s, and she was in the upper 3% of kids in her same grade in their district. But the average IQ in the United States is 98, and people generally have IQs between 85 and 115. To give you an example, 98% of people have an IQ below 130. So we're talking about adults here. So that's saying a lot about Jessica when she was in just elementary school level. And according to Psych Central, when I looked into this, your IQ score isn't simply about bragging about how smart you are. Knowing your IQ can help guide a child into beneficial learning programs, pinpoint developmental challenges, and provide insight into global wellness patterns. IQ was also broken down by state. I found a list, so for Ohio it's 100 and the global IQ is around 89. The principal of Oakview described Jessica as just a sweetheart of a kid. She was pretty intelligent, very cheerful, witty, and just a neat kid. And she stood out not just because of her intelligence, but she was also very talented when it came to music. She played the violin, the piano, and the clarinet. They do say that playing instruments positively influences your IQ, and research does show it can be raised by an average of 7 points. And Jessica could also sing. Her maternal grandfather, George Smetley, and her paternal grandpa, also named George, were amazed by how talented Jessica was. He said ever since she was a little girl, she would sit around and talk with adults. She was more advanced for her age. And when Jessica wasn't excelling in math or studying hard to maintain her gifted status at school, she was just an ordinary kid. She enjoyed dancing, acting, and doing gymnastics. The family lived in an apartment complex at the time, and it was filled with other children her age. She became best friends with a little girl named Rutabe Azadi, who immigrated to the U.S. from Iran. Jessica was the first to befriend her. They met in the apartment community, and they loved dancing together to routines they made to Madonna's music, and they would spend summers playing together all day long. Rutabe's parents adored Jessica, She was very respectful and sweet to their daughter, very accepting, and not to mention smart and witty. She was a good role model for Rutabaga. They would invite her over to enjoy Persian meals all the time, and Jessica took genuine interest in their culture. She loved Persian food and was curious about their traditions. She would actually sit fascinated when Rutabaga was doing her Persian homework. She was really into it because it was different and exotic to her. After elementary school, she attended Kettering Junior High School, but only until the 7th grade because, unfortunately, Jessica's mom and dad decided to get a divorce. It was a tough decision, but it was the right one for them at the time. Now, Rebecca's family lived back in Columbus, Ohio, which was about an hour away. It's still not too far for Jessica to go back and visit. Jim and Heather, yes, Heather was staying back with her dad. Heather was already in the middle of high school, so it seemed like a better plan to have her stay with Jim to finish up where she was. She had dreams of working in the medical field, so academic stability was important to her and her parents. Rebecca and Jessica moved from Kettering to Columbus in 1988 when Jessica was 13 years old. They would now be closer to Rebecca's parents, George and Ruth. At first, Rebecca was concerned with Jessica switching schools, but she had done so well academically in the past. She thought it would be just fine, and she was right. Jessica adapted very well when she went into the 8th grade in Columbus, Ohio. She made friends very easily because of her loving, outgoing personality. She liked hanging out and having fun with her friends, but she was also very dedicated to her studies. She was the type of student that could skim over the lesson and still be able to get an A, whereas many of the other students had to study really hard, even for little pop quizzes. Her IQ and her gifted classes in the past probably helped. By the time 9th grade came around and she was a freshman at Columbus Westland High School, Jessica already knew that she wanted to become a zoologist. And this was because of the love she had for animals. She was going to work hard to get into college and study veterinary medicine. That meant dedicating even more time to her schoolwork because she wanted to earn a scholarship. She worked hard to maintain a 4.0 average and was always on the honor roll. Well, while all the serious work was going on, another passion was forming in Jessica because of her bubbly and fun personality. She was drawn to cheerleading. She had been a gymnast as a child, and she loved acting and dancing, so this came naturally to her. And she made it on the high school football cheerleading squad. This definitely helped her make a lot more friends with all the girls that were on her team. And they had practices together and events, and then of course, the football games that they would have to attend. Her life became a lot more social, not just with girls but also with boys. By the summer going into her sophomore year of high school, she spent time back home in Dayton with her dad, her sister, and her old friends. And she could not stop talking about all the fun she was having with her new friends. Sherry Somm, one of her friends from back in Kettering, felt a little uncomfortable with some of the things that Jessica was telling her. After all, they were only 14 years old, and Jessica was talking about all these stories about how she was hanging out with older teenage boys, even boys that were 18 years old. It sounded like trouble to Sherry, especially when Jessica sort of bragged about staying out late with these boys that she hardly knew. Jessica even told her that she and a friend went hitchhiking, and this concerned Sherry. She knew that Jessica had always been a good girl, but you know what? Sometimes teens go through a rebellious stage. It just seemed to Sherry, with the way that Jessica was describing some of the things that her new friends were doing, that they didn't have many morals. And Sherry wondered what Jessica saw in them. It wasn't just Sherry that felt that way. The same thing happened with another old friend that summer in Kettering, Mindy Sidlow. She and Jessica were hanging out like old times, but something was different. When Jessica was telling Mindy all about her new friends, it seemed like she was getting mixed up with the wrong kind of crowd, the type that liked to stir up trouble. And she worried about Jessica, but she also knew how smart Jessica was, so she figured, you know what, it's just a phase, or she at least hoped so. Maybe her old friends just didn't understand her, but there were ones in her new home in Columbus that definitely did. and one of those friends was Nikki Mabry. Jessica and Nikki had become close over the time that she spent there. It seemed like Nikki understood Jessica, and she liked to have fun. She wasn't so uptight, and they were the typical high school girls, having crushes on boys, hanging out by their lockers, gossiping, and just being girls. Nikki knew how many boys were into Jessica, but Jessica was either super picky or just very focused on school and cheerleading, and boys just weren't a priority to her. By her sophomore year, Nikki, Jessica, and their other friends liked to go to the mall and hang out there on the weekends. The Galleria Mall in Columbus, Ohio was the place to be, dropped off by your parents for a couple of hours while you walked around, socialized, had fun with your friends, either window shopping or actually spending some of your allowance. Many times, they would just eat at the food court and hang out, and a lot of teens from the surrounding areas would go there since there wasn't that much for them to do, being under 21 and not really able to go partying at clubs or drink. They were kind of in between that age. They're not really kids, but they're not yet adults. Nikki and Jessica were at the mall one weekend when a guy, a friend of Nikki's, saw them hanging out and came over to say hello. Nikki's friend had another guy friend with him. His name was Shawn Thompson. So both of them were introduced to Jessica that day. Shawn was a senior at the time, he was a football player, and he and Jessica hit it off pretty quickly. He had seen her a few times before at football games, and homecoming was right around the corner, so the teens made conversation about all the fun and excitement they would have. Shawn was cute, he was popular, he was charming, and he thought Jessica was very attractive, and he wanted to get to know her better. He definitely didn't hide that fact. He was very flirtatious, and soon they were seeing each other more and more. Nikki could tell that Shawn boosted Jessica's confidence. She felt good around him. He would make her laugh and smile, and he loved to cater to her. Anytime they hung out, he was just sweet, and they got along so well that they became inseparable. It didn't take long before the two of them were more than friends. Shawn was Jessica's first boyfriend. She probably didn't know that she could like something or someone more than the dreams that she'd been chasing all those years, working hard in class, but now she was chasing after Shawn. He was all she thought about. She would be daydreaming about him in class, just doodling on her notebook, writing. You know, Jessica loved Shawn with hearts, the typical high school crush, puppy love, as some people like to call it, right? But it's real for those who feel it, and many of us can relate. Soon, Shawn took priority over everything else going on in her life. School was definitely not on the top of her list of things to do. It's a time when hormones are changing, and at times they're out of control. Jessica had a hard time concentrating, and her grades began to slip as a result. Soon, Shawn was all Jessica would talk about with her friends. And as happy as Nikki was for her, she also kind of felt like their friendship took a back seat. It was all about writing love letters, talking about how cute Shawn was, and making plans to hang out with him. And Jessica, with this being her first love, thought that she was going to marry him one day, like she was going to be future Mrs. Thompson. Rebecca was busy working for Time Warner Cable at the time, but when she would come home from work and spend time around Jessica, a child that she never used to have to worry about, she started to see things that caught her attention, like a notebook with the name Shawn written over it 100 times. But she just thought, you know what? It's a crush. And at her age, surely Jessica wasn't really taking this that seriously. It would probably be another boy's name on a notebook next month. But Jessica was also private about the way she felt, and she didn't share too much with her mom, probably because she knew she wouldn't agree with the things she was doing. It's true, Rebecca is about to find out one thing that infuriated her. Just weeks after they met, it was apparent Jessica was serious about her relationship with Shawn. It's where all of her effort was placed now. It was so exciting for her, but that excitement led her to make compromises once her friends and later her mother would not approve of. It started with skipping cheerleading practice. Shawn wanted to go to a movie one night, but she had to stay after school, so they wouldn't be able to go until later. But instead, Shawn kind of convinced Jessica to skip out on cheerleading. At first, Jessica was really concerned. She wasn't the type to do something like that. But Shawn and his friends, they were older, they had a car, and he kind of had that bad boy persona. And he was trying to keep that up, definitely know the type, the cool guy image, and Jessica didn't want to miss an opportunity to hang out with him, so she gave in. Shawn didn't take school seriously at all. He didn't care about getting good grades. He was more interested in getting out of high school and being able to do whatever he wanted to do as an adult. But with Jessica being only 15 and him being 18, she had a few years ahead of her before that would be the path she was walking down. But it seemed like Shawn wanted to rush that. It started with cheerleading, then with skipping last period, and then skipping more than one class a day, to skipping the entire day of school to hang out with Shawn and his friends. Nikki saw Jessica change over the next few months. She was like a different person, but Jessica didn't think anyone would take notice. She thought she could handle it, but people were taking note. This was really unlike her. One night, she even stayed out after her curfew. Rebecca waited up all night for her to come home. She was so worried about her, and when she walked through the door, Rebecca told her it was time they had a talk. She wasn't happy. She confronted Jessica about the fact that she didn't seem to care about anything anymore. She didn't care about cheerleading or school. Nothing seemed to matter these days. And those were the things she used to love and enjoyed doing. So it made Rebecca sad. It seemed like her daughter turned her back on all of the things that shaped her into who she had been working so hard to become. So as Jessica's mom, raising her all on her own, Rebecca just wanted to voice her concerns and to let Jessica know how worried she was. But it seemed like Rebecca's concerns were just another thing to add to the list of things that Jessica really didn't seem to care about. She actually just blew her mom off. She acted like Rebecca was overreacting. It was a school night, and Jessica wasn't studying, so Rebecca asked her, "How are you going to maintain your grades? How are you going to get a scholarship for college?" It's a scary time for a parent when it seems like their child is becoming more independent and they can't even recognize them anymore. I will link that case below, and at the end, it's sad. It's an uncertain time in this in-between phase in children's lives where they're becoming an adult, especially when dating is involved. Jessica got snappy with her mom, and this was one of many of these conversations that didn't help their relationship. Jessica pretty much told her mom to mind her own business, that she knew best, and thought her mom was just standing in the way of her happiness. Rebecca wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to push her too hard because she was scared that she might lose her daughter completely, so she just tried to trust Jessica and see what would happen. Maybe it was just a phase. But Jessica would confide in Nikki and other friends and complain about her mother all the time. Nikki, being a concerned friend, tried to make Jessica see her mom's point. She even said, "I kind of understand where your mom's coming from," and tried to make her see that not everyone had a caring mother like that, and she should be grateful that someone cared about her that much. Nikki was actually confused about why Jessica would get so angry with her mom, but Nikki couldn't get through to her either. She wanted what she wanted, and that was a life with Shawn. Well, Shawn's life was about to change, and Jessica would have to decide to come along for the ride or to stop in her tracks and decide to take a different path. Shawn's grades had dropped. He was skipping school all the time, and eventually, this led to him getting expelled. There were a lot of things going on in his personal life that he had to deal with, and Jessica was being dragged into that by choice. She just wanted to stand by her man, no matter what. And although Jessica had always been intelligent and level-headed, her relationship with Shawn changed that. Her feelings took precedence over logic, and then Jessica was getting in her own kind of trouble at school. The principal of the high school reached out to Rebecca to notify her that Jessica was skipping school, that her grades had dropped, and she quit cheerleading. Rebecca was shocked. She had no idea that this was happening. She was furious. This time, Rebecca wasn't so nice about it. They got into a full-blown yelling match, and Rebecca had enough. She knew that all of this started with Shawn. Jessica was no longer the well-behaved, sensible teenager she had once been. Jessica had become daring and less inhibited to a fault. The relationship with Shawn significantly affected Jessica's personality, and her mom was worried that this newfound recklessness would lead to even more trouble if she didn't do something about it. She had to stop it, so she forbade her to see Shawn. She said, "You can't see him until your grades come up." So Jessica threatened her by saying, "I'm gonna leave." She told her mom that she didn't want to live with her anymore. Rebecca didn't know what to do. She felt like she failed as a parent because she didn't see the signs earlier. She thought maybe she could have done something months ago to stop this, but Jessica just threw a fit, telling her mom she hated her to get out of her life. She really couldn't see the damage that she was doing, not only to her future, but to her mom, who cared about her so much. Like many teens, Jessica found it difficult to reconcile her mother's behavior with the image of a mom who was only trying to protect her daughter. This entire plan to keep her from Shawn ended up backfiring, of course. Call it forbidden love or star-crossed lovers, but this only made Jessica run faster into Shawn's arms. She told her mom she was going to be with him no matter what, and she couldn't stop her. Rebecca was also in fear for her daughter's safety. She's a sophomore in high school at the time. She had so much to learn. She's not an adult, and legally she can't decide anything on her own yet, so it was actually Rebecca's responsibility to do something. But she needed help. She tried what she could for the next few months. She tried reasoning with Jessica, taking things away, not letting her have privileges, but nothing worked. And after she exhausted all of her resources, Rebecca reached out to a guidance counselor at Westland High School for assistance. She told the counselor that she and Jessica were at odds all the time. Their arguments were escalating, and she was losing control. The counselor was more than happy to help and provided very useful advice that Rebecca was able to put into action right then and there. They offered counseling sessions for mother and daughter at a place called Huckleberry House. This is a teen crisis center. It's located in the inner city of Columbus. The center provided a variety of resources depending on what a child needed, from just doing counseling sessions to in-house programs where a teen could stay overnight for a specific period of time. It was a safe haven for teens like Jessica, who needed someone to talk to and guide them through these difficult times. I looked, and they're still in operation today. They offer a 24-hour teen crisis hotline for youth and their families. The website says they help Central Ohio youth who are struggling with homelessness, family conflict, poverty, and violence. It says that it's just a safe place where you can stay for a night or two. You can expect to find a no-judgment zone where the goal is to keep you safe and start sorting out the issues in a way that respects your needs and your unique situation. It's a temporary place for teens to stay. They get hot meals, a warm bed, and access to necessities like clothing and hygiene products. And the best part is, they have professionals who are ready and willing to listen and help. I watched a video outlining what they do there, and there's a lot of activities for teens. There's sports. They have a very welcoming staff and like-minded people, and teens that room together and bond. They even do things like chores and help out, and then, of course, get professional assistance that they need. In Jessica's case, after she was evaluated and they understood the situation, it was concluded she would benefit from a 24-hour crisis shelter program where she would stay at the Huckleberry House temporarily and learn skills necessary to resolve the conflicts that she was having at home, including individual counseling and sessions with her mom and a therapist. This was the last resort for Jessica and her mom. Yet after a long discussion, they concluded that taking time apart and having a cooling-off period was the best thing to do. So Rebecca enrolled Jessica in an intensive 2-week program on March 4th, 1991. And even though Jessica was not pleased with this arrangement, she eventually understood how important it was and the positive impact it would have on her life. She was finally seeing the bigger picture, and she was still allowed to have phone calls with friends and, of course, with Shawn, so she felt like it would be okay. And she was determined to make the most of her time there. Maybe her mom would even end up seeing her point of view. After just a few sessions together, it was already becoming very beneficial for both of them. They had a safe place where they could express their concerns in a healthy way, get emotional. They could show how much they cared about one another when they weren't at each other's throats and having these screaming matches. While there, Jessica was working to bring up her grades, and she was also getting back into activities that she used to love. It seemed like this was going very well. Her stay was set to end on Friday, March 15th, so the very next day, on Saturday, she would be released and could go back home. She was excited. She wanted to be free and, of course, hang out with Shawn again. 2 weeks may not seem that long, but when you're young, it can seem like a lifetime, and she was doing the best while counting down the days. Rebecca was so happy that Jessica would be back home. She was so proud of her. Jessica had shown a lot of maturity by being open to the whole idea of having counseling sessions together. Their final one was Friday afternoon. It was just one day until Jessica was back. Rebecca had calmed down. She wasn't angry anymore, and she was looking forward to their future together. She could have never imagined what would happen next, definitely not Jessica herself. There was one thing that wasn't going well while she was stuck at the Huckleberry house. Those 2 weeks made her and Shawn drift apart. They were used to seeing a lot more of one another, and now that Shawn wasn't in school, he wasn't doing high school stuff anymore. He was even more independent, and without being around Jessica, he started to realize how good that freedom felt. It created tension in the relationship. Shawn was going out and having fun with his friends, while Jessica was stuck in a teen center. She may have been there for him no matter what, but when the tables were turned, it didn't seem like Shawn had put his life on pause for her. She called him that Friday afternoon. She was excited to let him know, "I'm coming home. I'm getting out the next day." But Shawn didn't know what that meant for them anymore, and Jessica was confused. Shawn told her that things just felt different between them. It was like he moved on, and this made Jessica really anxious. It seemed like Shawn was sick of being blamed for Jessica's issues, and as much as he loved her, he thought it would be best if they broke up. Can you imagine what must have been going on in this 15-year-old's mind? This is her first boyfriend, this is her life. Jessica still had 2 more years of high school, and it was clear her mother didn't like Shawn, but Jessica begged him, "Please don't break up with me." She was really scared and upset, especially when he told her that he was going with some friends to the mall and then to a party. She didn't want him to go without her. She was so desperate to see him, so she told him, "You know what, I'll meet you at the mall in like 20 minutes. It was close to 6 p.m. at the time, but the mall wasn't that far from the Huckleberry house. It was actually only a 5-minute drive, a 20-minute bus ride, but it was a 47-minute walk, so she'd definitely take the bus, which she was used to doing all the time. And it was only a 1-minute walk to the bus stop, located on East 8th Avenue and Summit Street. You can see it right here on the map. It's actually right around the corner. It was her last evening there, but she couldn't let Shawn slip away. She wanted to get to the mall as soon as possible. All the while, Rebecca was preparing for Jessica to come home the next day. She had no idea that she just skipped out of the Huckleberry house to go hang out with the boy who started all this drama to begin with. It was getting later, and some nights while Jessica was at the Huckleberry house, she would call her mom to say goodnight, and sometimes her mom would call her. But that night, neither one of them did, and Rebecca just felt like, "You know what, there's so much to do. I'm getting the house ready. I'm gonna see her in the morning," so they could both get a good night's sleep and not bother one another. As it got later and Rebecca was getting into bed, she assumed Jessica had been asleep for a while already, safe at the Huckleberry house. But she was about to find out that wasn't the case, not at all. The Huckleberry house had an 11 p.m. head count, and when the RAs were making their rounds, they couldn't locate Jessica. It was close to midnight when Rebecca was woken up by the phone ringing. It was someone from Huckleberry house informing her that Jessica was not accounted for, and Rebecca was furious. All the hard work that they had both put in, and she runs off, most likely to go see Shawn. She can't believe it. She tells the Huckleberry house she thinks she knows where she is. Rebecca figures this is just another one of Jessica's little games. Rebecca's thinking that in Jessica's mind she thinks, I'm coming home the next day, so hell with this whole plan. I made nice long enough, and now it's time to do what I want and not see Shawn. So now it's Rebecca's mission to find her daughter. She's calling all of Jessica's friends, asking if they'd heard or seen from her that day, and they said they hadn't. And it was late, so Rebecca wasn't going to call that many people. She just figured at some point she would get a call from Jessica asking to be picked up and apologizing. Rebecca went back to bed, anticipating Jessica's call, but it never came. The next morning, Rebecca expected to hear from her daughter, but she didn't, so she really started to worry. She thought maybe Jessica had finally followed through on the threat she used to say that she was going to run away from home. Rebecca decided to call some of her friends over, and they agreed to go around the town, all different places where they knew Jessica might be, and try to locate her. But none of them could, so they banded together at Rebecca's house to offer her support. She had tried a number of times to contact Shawn, but he never answered or returned her calls. Rebecca was trying hard to understand what may have been happening. Why would Jessica not come home? It wasn't like her to stay out overnight. It would be one thing for her to come home late, but this had never happened. So she figured, you know what, maybe she's scared to come home. Maybe she thinks she's gonna get in trouble. Maybe she fell asleep when she was out with Shawn. She didn't get a chance to come home, and now she's fearful to go back to the Huck house because she left the way that she did. So finally, Rebecca called the police, but to them, it was looking like Jessica was a runaway. They see it all too often. A teen gets in arguments with their parents, they're sent to Huckleberry house, they get some independence, and they choose to run away instead of coming home. They needed Rebecca to calm down and wait. Well, you don't have to demand to report your minor child missing. There's number 48-hour rule, but back then, Rebecca didn't know any better. She thought that the cops knew best. Meanwhile, she decided to do only things she could right now, and that was to write a letter to God. She said, even if Jessica doesn't come home for yet another night, just please let me know she's okay. But Jessica wasn't okay. The next day was Sunday, March 17th, a little after noon. A young photography student was exploring a place called Foster Chapel Cemetery and taking photographs when she saw something in the distance. It didn't look right. She kept snapping pictures, and she was getting closer and closer, trying to figure out what it was that she was looking at through her viewfinder. She thought it might be a person sleeping in the grass, so she called out to them, but they didn't answer. She took a few more steps towards them in their direction, and it was clear that the person was not clothed. Then she realized they were covered in blood. She had just stumbled upon a deceased person in a cemetery. That must have been terrifying and confusing. So many thoughts were probably running through her mind. Is this a person who was dug up by someone? What is going on? Frantic, the college student fled. She went to go find a phone, called 911, and told them everything she just saw. Sheriff Jim Sabin from Madison County Sheriff's Office, along with prosecutor Steve Prone, responded to that call. They were told the approximate location of the body. It was in the southeast corner of the cemetery. So they made their way over to that area. Officer Sabin located a nude female lying about 20 feet from a grave and close to a wire fence. Her body was partially hidden by a gravestone. Prosecutor Prone took a look and was mortified by what he saw. He said it could only be described as sickening. There was blood everywhere, and it was actually the condition of her face and her head that was the most horrific. Her face had been beaten until it wasn't even a face anymore. It was obvious how violent this attack was. Her upper body was covered in slashes, abrasions, and bruises. She had nothing on but a tangled and twisted bra that was kind of hanging off her chest and one single muddy white sock on one of her feet. As they scanned the immediate area, they didn't see her clothing nearby. No pants, no shirt or underwear were present in the area, and as they looked around preliminarily, they could see footprints in the soft, muddy ground, footprints that they knew were probably made by their victim. She didn't have a wallet or a purse, so there was no way to identify her. But by the look of the body, from what they could tell, she appeared to be in her early 20s, possibly younger. They couldn't be sure. Homicide and crime scene investigators were called in. They decided to work backward to figure out how she got to this resting place. They wanted to attempt to retrace her path through the cemetery. This was a very rural area, not a place where just anyone would usually find themselves. It was about 20 miles from Columbus, out in the middle of nowhere. All that was around was farmland. The homes were very sparse, scattered across acres and acres of land, with the closest one being about a quarter of a mile away. They wondered who she was and how she got there. This area is actually called Plains City, and that is fitting. It's one of the most rural areas I think I've seen in a case that I've covered so far. Just as far as how empty it is, how there's just farmland as far as the eye can see. Just look at it. So for someone to be found in a place like this, so far from this city, it was challenging to figure out. So they began at the scene. Where had she come from, and where did the altercation begin? As they worked backward, following her footprints, they saw impressions in the soft soil behind a tombstone. It looked like they were made with knees or elbows, as though she was in a crouched position, hiding behind these graves. They found these impressions by several other tombstones. They believed that she was using them to take cover from an attacker. Each one was closer and closer to the front of the cemetery. And as they got closer to the entrance, they saw yet another white sock laying in the grass next to a cement driveway that comes through the cemetery. The sock was dirty and matched the one that the victim had on her other foot. They also noticed that it contained little rocks and yellow paint chips, which indicated to investigators that this woman had been running from the roadway. They were standing even closer now to the front of the cemetery when they saw something. A piece of gray duct tape stuck to the top of one of the gravestones, and there were long strands of hair still sticking to it. They kept making their way, following each clue, until they saw another one on a wooden fence in the front of the cemetery. It actually looked like muddy handprints, the ones that would be left if someone climbed over the fence to get inside. They thought that this is where the victim made entry. But where did she come from? The footprints went through a ditch beside the roadway, and clearly she wasn't familiar with the cemetery, because if she were, she would know, you don't need to climb over a fence to get inside. There was an entrance big enough to drive right through it, and it wasn't that far away. But then again, it was apparent she was running from an attacker, or attackers, making quick, in-the-moment decisions. The trail pretty much goes cold once they've reached the roadway. It's called Georgeville Road. This led the investigators to believe that she came here by car, either by force, or she ran or escaped out of a vehicle on this roadway. They don't really have that much to go on. They doubt anyone would have been anywhere nearby and would have heard anything or seen anything. Their theory is that she was running from her assailant and jumped over the fence in the dark, not even realizing it was a cemetery. And she attempted to flee but ended up being attacked before she could get away. There was no question this poor girl was running for her life. It was probably very confusing for her to navigate these surroundings, the dark, ancient tombstones, derelict mausoleums. It added to the sense of terror, even to the investigators who were used to very violent scenes. They felt a chill as they were looking through the grounds of the cemetery for clues. There is just nothing out there at night. It would be pitch black. There's no lamppost or street signal, and there's almost nowhere to run and hide. No one would hear you scream, and scarier yet, she was running among the dead. Any screams would have been in vain. They were still scouring the entire cemetery for clues, and that's when they spot something else. The back, near where the victim's body was found, in the far corner of the cemetery. They see two bloody pieces of a large tombstone. It was about 20 inches wide and 30 inches high and 70 pounds, and it's broken in half. They realize they just found the murder weapon. The attacker had actually grabbed this tombstone and pulled it from the soil and used it to beat the victim. That, to me, is just more than terrifying. It's like something you would hear in a horror movie, but this is someone's real life. And some of these graves had been there since the 1700s, so it wouldn't have been difficult to remove a headstone like this. But to think of someone repeatedly bashing it into someone's head and their neck, their face, that's just unbelievable. What kind of monster would do such a thing, and why? Just the thought of what she must have gone through was heartbreaking for me, and of course the investigators. They couldn't help but feel sad, but they had to continue the investigation and use that as fuel. Now I want to tell you the items that were found and sent to the crime lab for analysis. One muddy sock was found near the driveway, as I said, and that contained microfibers and debris. Hair from a wire fence that was just a few feet east of the body. Vegetation from the fence that they wanted to test for blood. A section of a wood fence post that appeared to have blood on it. One gold earring and a white bead collected from the victim's hair. A soil sample that was collected right next to her left foot. Miscellaneous trash that was in the ditch line in front of the cemetery that they wanted to test for prints, just in case. As well as a cowboy boot and broken car parts from the west side of a small bridge in the area. 2 rolls of Kodak Color 100 film. And lastly, they had a piece of gray duct tape with a clump of hair on it that was found on the headstone belonging to Anthony Lee Taylor. They were going to test that for latent prints, hairs, and fibers. They had also bagged both of the victim's hands. Her left hand had microfibers, hair, and debris on it. They also collected the slabs of sandstone tombstone to see if they could pull any fingerprints off of them. No, now Sheriff Sabin is focused on finding out who the victim is. At the same time, news had traveled, and word got out about the body of a young female being found dead in a cemetery out in Madison County. Rebecca was stunned. She was praying it wasn't Jessica, but she called the police to let them know she'd called a couple of days ago and her daughter was still missing. Sheriff Sabin, along with other officers, went over to Rebecca's residence. She gave them a description of her daughter: white, golden brown hair, green eyes, 15 years old. And that was hard for investigators to hear. They knew their victim was young, but 15? They too, of course, were hoping this wasn't her, but the only way they could figure that out was, unfortunately for Rebecca, to look at pictures of the deceased victim. But by that time, the body had been taken to the Franklin County Coroner's Office for autopsy, so the body had been cleaned. That way it was more identifiable. So Rebecca agreed, and she was handed the photographs. And as she was slipping through, she was shocked. She'd never seen anyone in such a horrific state. This victim had black eyes, a busted lip, a huge cut across her chest, and Rebecca said, "No, that is not my daughter." She kept looking, but she just didn't recognize the girl in the pictures. It wasn't Jessica. She just kept shaking her head and saying, No, this isn't my daughter." But the thing is, Sheriff Sabin had caught a glimpse of a photograph of Jessica as he entered the home. He knew right away the body he found in the cemetery was hers. But sadly, he knew, like many other parents in these moments, Rebecca was in shock, and she was in denial. They needed an alternative person to identify the body as Jessica's. So a family friend went down to the morgue and confirmed it was her. Finally, it had been determined that the murder victim found at the Foster Chapel Cemetery was 15-year-old Jessica Lynn Keene. And eventually this was confirmed through autopsy. Actually, let's go right into that as well. The autopsy report from the Franklin County Coroner's Office, it was performed by Dr. Patrick Fartell. First of all, it was clear that Jessica had been murdered. The type of injuries she sustained could not have been self-inflicted, so the manner of death was ruled a homicide. The cause of death was blunt force impact to the head and neck, specifically a fractured mandible, which is the bottom jaw, a brain bleed from force impacting her head, an injury to the neck and aspiration of blood, choking on her own blood. It was truly sad. Any of those things could have caused her death. It was truly sad. This was a very painful and possibly slow death. It could have been agonizing. It could have gone on for hours, and she most likely suffered all alone until she took her final breath. It's just particularly heinous. And there's more. There was sperm present from a vaginal swab. And something else that I found interesting is that apparently by looking at the semen sample under a microscope, they can get a general window of time when the assault occurred. This is due to the lifespan of sperm, which can live up to about 7 days. They can estimate how long the sperm have been active and look at their mobility at the point they're collected. And I'm not a scientist, I don't know how all this actually works, but later when they're building a timeline of events, this is one of the ways they do it, by looking at the sperm sample. We'll get back to that in a moment. But now they know what the motive could have been. Or was this just something else the perpetrator did because he could, to violate her? But more importantly, they have DNA. This meant they most likely had the killer's DNA. But in 1991, DNA was brand new. It was nothing like it is today at all. The tests that they used to perform were called RFLP. This stands for Restriction Fragment Length Polymorphism. This was actually the first DNA profiling technique that was inexpensive enough to be able to be used on a widespread scale to solve crimes with forensic science. So they use these enzymes to break apart the DNA into pieces, and they compare the resulting fragment lengths. That's where it gets its name, but it's very limited. This technique would result in what they call an autoradiogram. And I know you've seen one of these before. It almost looks like a Scantron when you fill it out when you're taking a test, and they have the DNA sequences on them from the suspect so that they can become compared to the sample collected at the crime scene. See this right here? You've probably seen this before. Well, this is how it used to be done, and a scientist would sit there and compare them. I'll show you a better example instead. See, the first strip is the sample collected at the crime scene, and then the 3 on the right are swabs that they took from suspects. Now, look, see how theoretically suspect number 2 matches the sample from the crime scene. Because they match up. That's how this science used to work, to match criminals to the DNA left behind. So that is what they did in this case. They took that semen sample, they got a DNA sequence from it, and they made an autoradiogram. And now they could use it to compare to anyone they thought may have killed Jessica. But that's the thing. This DNA is only good if you have another DNA to compare to. So they need to get their boots on the ground and talk to people close to Jessica and find out if there was anyone that would have wanted to hurt her. First, they speak with Rebecca, who is absolutely devastated. She's beside herself with sadness. She said that this was exactly what she was trying so hard to prevent, and now it actually happened. The first person that she tells investigators that they should look into is Shawn Thompson. She gives them all of his information. She tells them he is a black male, he's 18 years old, this is where he lives, this is his phone number, his approximate height and weight, and the last time she knows that he had seen or spoken to Jessica. But she doesn't know much, however. She tells them, "I am certain that Jessica was with Shawn the night she disappeared from Huckleberry House." Jessica's sister Heather received the news about her little sister, and she was in complete shock. She said she stood there just moaning in sadness and disbelief. She couldn't even cry. It was just this gut-wrenching feeling, and she couldn't believe this was really happening, that it could actually be true, that her little sister was not only dead, but she had been murdered. How and why? Those were the questions that kept being repeated by everyone, even the investigators, of course. Jessica had barely lived in Columbus 2 years, so most of her closest friends were back in her old town where she grew up. And when they were given the news of the murder, they were all heartbroken. But not all of them were shocked. There were some that told investigators they knew something like this was going to happen. Remember the friends that she saw during the summer? One of them was Sherry. She mentioned to the police that she had been worried about Jessica ever since she told her about her new friend group and the hitchhiking and the recklessness. It all concerned Sherry, and she felt like nothing good was going to come out of it. And now her childhood friend is dead, and she points investigators toward Jessica's new friend group. Then Mindy comes forward and she repeats the same concerns, that Jessica was mixed up with the wrong crowd, and now look what happened. Remember whom Jessica befriended at the apartment complex as a child? Well, she and her mother were stunned. Her mother, Maisie, said that Jessica was smart and intelligent and beautiful, and that this was a disaster. And Rutabaga said that when they were young, your parents tell you that bad things can happen, but you don't believe them. When this happens to someone you love, it teaches you to be fearful. And that was the current that was running through this whole case. Fear. And it seemed many people close to Jessica were fearful of her new friend group, specifically her boyfriend, Shawn. So that's who authorities wanted to talk to. But conveniently, Shawn was nowhere to be found. The next stop was Huckleberry House, where investigators were informed that the last time the staff had seen Jessica was 3 p.m. on Friday afternoon. All the teens were interviewed, and many of them echoed the same sequence of events. That Jessica came there in early March. She stayed for about 2 weeks, and over the course of her time there, she spoke with the other teens about her boyfriend, Shawn, who she was also on the phone with every day. And the day she disappeared, however, they said that Shawn and Jessica had been arguing a lot lately, mainly over her not being able to see him. They wanted to get together so they could discuss things and see if they could work them out. On her last day there, she was on the phone with Shawn towards the evening. All of a sudden, they heard her start to argue with him. She was visibly upset and eventually began to cry and to beg Shawn not to break up with her. When she got off the phone, she told one of the other teens that was present that she and Shawn had broken up, but that she was going to meet him at the mall, and then she left. As the investigators canvassed the surrounding area, a witness who also stayed at the Huckleberry House said that they saw Jessica at the bus stop around 6 p.m. Friday evening. It's the one I showed you earlier, on the corner of Summit Street and East 8th Avenue. This was all the information they had to build out a timeline of events prior to her murder. She was never seen by anyone after 6 p.m. that night, and she was on her way to meet up with Shawn, who they now know had been arguing with her. And apparently, there were whispers about a gold necklace with the word "taken" on it that Shawn had given Jessica. She always wore it, and the word was spreading about how it was never found at the crime scene, which was true. It hadn't been found. New articles were coming out every day with interviews from different teens that Jessica had been friends with, which ended up leading to even more new articles that spun the narrative in the direction of accusing Jessica's mom of not liking Shawn because he was black and Jessica was white. However, not only did Rebecca clear the air on this, but so did many of Jessica's friends, including Nikki. They said Jessica never mentioned that as a reason her mom was upset. They said Rebecca's dislike for Shawn had to do with the way that Jessica behaved after the two started dating, his age, and the fact that he left school. It had nothing to do with his race. Carissa Hill, a 14-year-old friend of Jessica's in Columbus, said yeah, Shawn was the issue, but her mom disapproved because Shawn was a bad influence on Jessica. Of course, we can never get inside Rebecca's mind, but this was the first guy Jessica had ever dated, so I think no matter what it was, the fact she was dating a guy and that he took precedence over everything else. Rebecca had told Jessica that if she could get her grades up, she could see him, but Jessica just kept acting more and more irresponsible. It was hard in this moment, when her daughter was murdered, not to hate Shawn, who she blamed for tearing her daughter away from her and probably ending her life. She definitely did not have positive things to say about him. He was still nowhere to be found. And a girl named Danielle Gillenwater, a 15-year-old friend of Jessica's, told the investigators that Shawn had actually left town with a friend. He was in Florida. And then she added, he doesn't even know Jessica's dead. Well, that was debatable. But now they had a bulletin out from Ohio down to Florida. Officers would now be on the lookout for a car matching the description of the one that Shawn and his friend left in. Apparently, Shawn decided to skip town right before Jessica's body had been found, and after 6 p.m. on Friday night, when she was on her way to meet him. Clearly, this was seen as a blatant attempt to evade authorities. Florida is a prime location to get out of the country as well, so they were still looking for him. By the 28th of March, almost 2 weeks after Jessica's body had been found, he and his buddy got pulled over in Georgia. They detained both of them and started questioning them, and ultimately they brought them back to Ohio for more in-depth interrogation, as well as DNA swabs. This is when Shawn was informed that Jessica had been killed, and he was in total shock. It truly didn't seem like he had a clue about what happened, but he had almost 2 weeks to practice this response. They asked him why he fled Ohio, and he explained there were a few reasons. First of all, he and his friends decided it was time to take a spring break vacation to Florida, which was a very common location for many teens and college students at the time. It still is today, but back in the 90s, it was the place for spring break. It was the spring break capital, but he also said he wanted to leave Ohio because he had been arrested for burglary, and he was trying to avoid a court date that he had. That didn't look good for him, but he promised that he wasn't trying to flee because of anything related to Jessica. But he told them he had been trying to distance himself from her because he didn't want to be the cause of all the friction between her and her mom. He felt that they would be better off breaking up, and they had broken up on Friday evening. He did wait around at the mall for a while, but she never showed up, so he just figured she couldn't leave the Huckleberry house. His ride was finally leaving, and he left with his friends. But he insisted that he had nothing to do with her murder, and he gave a sample of his DNA, and so did his friend. That friend was 19-year-old George Cole. He had caught the eye of detectives. Despite the fact that he was pretty young, George had an extensive criminal record. He had been arrested multiple times and charged with various offenses, ranging from petty theft to vandalism to other crimes. His record was a sign of trouble, and it piqued the detectives' interests. During their interviews, the detectives learned there had been arguments between George and Jessica in the past, but they would have to wait another 2 weeks to get those DNA results back. Meanwhile, results from other pieces of evidence were finally back from the crime scene. Unfortunately, no fingerprints were able to be taken off of that bloody slab of tombstone that had been used to bludgeon Jessica. The sandstone that was used to make these tombstones back then was very rough and porous, and it was too difficult to test for prints. There were also no fingerprints on the duct tape and no evidence from the socks that they found. But then a tip comes in about Shawn's friend George. Allegedly, he had been walking around town bragging about killing Jessica. One person claimed he threatened to do the same thing that he did to the girl in the graveyard. After the detectives received these tips, they called George back in. But during his interview, yes, he admits, "I made those disturbing remarks, but I said it because I wanted to impress my friends and enhance my image." Let me ask you, what kind of person thinks that that's impressive? Before they could even dive in any further, something big happens. A clue comes in from a local resident of Madison County. He had been driving down that same road in front of the cemetery late on Friday night, actually in the middle of the night, past midnight. He said he saw a car in the middle of the road with its headlights on, but it wasn't moving, so he decided to park behind it, get out of his truck, and walk over to see if someone was in need of assistance. As he gets closer, he realizes the driver's door is wide open and the keys are still inside, and the car's running, but no one's in there. He looked in the back seat. Nothing. It was just really unusual. Now, this wasn't in front of the cemetery, though. It was before you come up on the cemetery, several hundred yards from it. This meant if Jessica had been screaming from the cemetery at this point, this man who was standing at the roadside most likely wouldn't have been able to hear her. It was just too far away. However, investigators now believe that this was the car that Jessica was in prior to her death, and the person driving was probably the killer. The resident that observed the car didn't stay that much longer because there wasn't much for him to do. As weird as it was, something to note is that this area would have been the perfect place to hurt someone and hide their body, not in the cemetery, but actually right here, Prairie Oaks hiking trail. Yes, indeed, look at this place. There is a road that leads right to the trail from Georgeville Road, and once you're on that trail, there are so many very dense wooded areas and a number of bodies of water. It would be very hard to find a person's remains in this location, and it could have been where the killer intended to take Jessica before she was able to escape and run into that cemetery. We don't know where they were coming from, but the resident said the car was parked several hundred feet north of the cemetery, and the hiking trail would have been on that road right past the cemetery. The hiking trail is only a quarter of a mile from the southeast portion of that cemetery where Jessica's body was found. Not to mention, the killer could have planned to pull over anywhere along this road and cause her death, and then dispose of her in this field or drive to the trail after she was deceased. That actually could have been what was happening when he pulled the car over before it reached the cemetery. A struggle that Jessica was somehow able to break free from long enough to run as fast as she could. We know she had duct tape on her somewhere because a piece of it ended up on a gravestone, and because there was hair on it, the investigators believed that that specific piece of duct tape found at the scene had been over Jessica's mouth to keep her from screaming. But she could have had it on her wrists, and she was able to break free from it and left it in the car. She probably realized that this man had a plan, and it wouldn't end with her being able to walk away and talk about it. We will never know exactly what happened in those moments, but what detectives do know now is that Shawn Thompson's DNA results came back, and they were shocking. They did not match the swab taken from Jessica at the crime scene, and his friend's DNA didn't match either. They both had alibis, and they checked out as well. All along, Jessica's mom kept saying she was certain that Jess was with Shawn that night. "Aunt, you can't be certain of anything unless you truly have proof." The proof the investigators had was scientific evidence. It had ruled Shawn out. In that semen sample, they were able to give them a timeline of when the first attack on Jessica took place. Judging by the declaration of the oldest sperm, they placed the assailant and Jessica together and having forced intercourse around 7:30 or 8 p.m. when Shawn was at the mall and left to go to a party with friends. This was only about 30 minutes to an hour after she was last seen at the bus stop, with no proof that she even stepped foot on a bus. When news of Jessica's murder spread throughout Columbus, tips started coming in. One caller reported finding a pair of sneakers north of the cemetery on the road. This information was taken very seriously, and the police department assigned officers to investigate these tips. Detectives received a call from someone else who had discovered a pair of jeans near the interstate ramp to I-70, traveling eastbound. Upon investigation, the detectives concluded that the jeans and the sneakers were Jessica's, but they didn't understand why Jessica's belongings were found so far from the crime scene at the cemetery. The clothing was nowhere near the mall or the Huckleberry house either. And as they're looking through all this clothing, the detectives find 2 bus tickets and 2 transfer stickers in the back pocket of Jessica's jeans. This led them to believe that she never boarded the bus. She traveled frequently by bus, and she would have previously purchased a book of paper bus passes that she could use to get from one place to another, like the Huckleberry house, back home, to school. And they believe she had brought enough to get to and from the mall and Huckleberry house, but never used them. Investigators concluded that Jessica had been abducted from the bus stop. Now they needed to find out who took her. Nikki told them that they never got into a car with someone unless they knew them. She said there could be a chance that maybe it was somebody Jessica knew, or kind of knew. Maybe it wasn't a really good friend, but someone she was familiar enough with that she trusted them to get in their car, not knowing what would ultimately happen. But she was so desperate to see Shawn that night. She wanted to get to him as soon as she could because he had broken up with her and he was about to go out and have fun without her. So investigators think that someone drove up and offered Jessica a ride to the mall. And unfortunately, the urgency to see Shawn made Jessica compromise her safety. Amon Costello, the assistant prosecutor at the time, said, "Imagine being picked up, thinking that this kind, Good Samaritan is doing you a favor and taking you to the shopping mall, but instead, you're taken 30 minutes away and attacked repeatedly. Then, after dark and you've been held captive for hours, you're driven out to rural Madison County, knowing this man is not going to leave you out there alive." He went on to say, she had no way to protect herself. All she could do was try to punch, hit, and kick this man. Jessica was athletic and feisty. Her family called her a fighter, so there was no doubt in people's minds that she put up quite a fight. We know that she was somehow able to break free and get out of that car, but this was before we had cell phones, and in this area, there were no streetlights, let alone a payphone. The only thing you could do was find a house and knock on their door, praying they're going to answer and let you use the phone to call 911. Now that the detectives have a theory, they go back to the evidence in the crime scene, trying to put together what they think happened after Jessica jumped out of that car. From what they gathered, they think that she managed to get out of the restraints, open the passenger's door, and run. She probably had no idea she was running into that cemetery, but she had no choice. She was desperately trying to find a place to hide, and she used the gravestones to conceal her from her attacker. The investigators go back at night, and they look at what Jessica would have seen, and they notice they can see a farmhouse in the distance. Jessica probably saw that house too. It wasn't that close by, but it was the only one around, and it could have had a light on. So she did the smart thing and made a run for it. The thing is, she didn't realize in the dark that the cemetery had a fence around the sides. It wasn't as visible as the one she jumped over in the front. It was a wire fence with wooden posts. She probably waited and rested behind one of the gravestones. She saw her attacker was far enough away that she could gain some distance from him, and she made a run for it towards that farmhouse. She ran with all of her might, only to be stopped dead in her tracks by slamming into one of the wooden posts at full speed. They believe this is what happened because her hair was actually tangled up in the wires in the fence right in front of where they found her body. She could have been knocked unconscious by the force, only to have her attacker catch up with her and callously end her life. It's truly sad. She had nowhere to go. Everyone wanted answers. Meanwhile, they have to prepare for Jessica's funeral. Heather lived 70 miles away, but as soon as she heard that news, she raced home to be with her mother. When Heather eventually arrived, she found Rebecca shaking and crying. There were just so many unanswered questions. Heather and Rebecca needed to focus on preparing for Jessica's funeral, so that's what they did. It wasn't really Rebecca, though, because nobody could console her. The thought of her daughter being gone forever was too much. She couldn't help but feel responsible for Jessica's death in some way. So Jessica's sister, Heather, only being a teenager herself at the time, had to take on this task of planning her baby sister's funeral. Heather had to make all the arrangements herself, including picking out Jessica's casket, which was a heartbreaking experience for such a young person. Hundreds of people had gathered to pay their respects to Jessica and her family. On the day of her funeral, Jessica was laid to rest in the peaceful grounds of Sunset Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. And Jessica may have finally been able to rest, but her family and detectives were not. Jessica's family knew that the longer the investigation went on without an arrest, the smaller the chance was that they'd ever solve her murder. The experience was so traumatic for her entire family. Rebecca said she became obsessed with finding her daughter's killer. She checked in with the detectives all the time to see if any progress had been made. She was also paranoid whenever she saw a strange guy. She couldn't help but wonder, was that man who killed Jessica? Her mind was consumed with getting justice for her daughter, and I don't blame her. But for years, Jessica's murder had been an ongoing mystery that eluded detectives. Her case had become so perplexing that it eventually appeared on the popular TV show, Unsolved Mysteries. On the show, Rebecca was actually interviewed, and she talked about how she could almost imagine the way Jessica would have felt, being so scared that night, her heart pounding, hiding behind those gravestones, praying to Jesus to save her. Rebecca also said that she doesn't seek revenge. She believes only God has the right to take a life. However, if someone did this and got away with it, Rebecca did fear that they would do it again. She said that Unsolved Mysteries was their last chance to find out who killed Jessica. Unfortunately, it never brought any tips that led them to the killer. 5 years went by, and in May of 1996, they still hadn't arrested anyone, and the case went cold. Sheriff Sabin enlisted the help of Special Agent Greg Costas of the BCI, and he took on the case. But he got very emotionally involved, even though he was a veteran detective, and that was because Jessica was so young. But he started from the beginning as though he had been put on the case from day one. He went back through all the information and re-interviewed everyone, including Mr. Shawn Thompson and his friend, George Cole. And that's when he finds out they weren't alone on that Florida trip. They went with 4 other guys, so they had to track them down and interview them. They had never even been spoken to all of those years, so that's a start right there. And he gets DNA from all 4 of them. He polygraphed all 6 of them because none of them had ever even taken a polygraph. And guess what? Nothing matched. None of their DNA matched, and they all passed the polygraphs. It was another dead end. Over the years, the Dayton Daily News had been running Crime Stopper ads. They were asking for tips and offering a $100,000 reward, but the detectives received no credible leads. Again, time ticks by. It's March of 2001, the 10th anniversary of Jessica's murder, and still, they have no answers. One big change, though, was that CODIS had been formed since the murder. It's the Combined DNA Index System, and that's exactly what it is. It's a system that combines all the DNA samples of all the criminals so they can track them nationwide and see if their DNA links to any other cases. Well, during the time that Special Agent Costas took over the case, he wanted to submit that semen sample into CODIS. Now, they knew there wasn't a guarantee that the killer's DNA would be in their system, because for that to have happened, he would have had to commit another violent crime and then been caught since 1991, when Jessica's murder had occurred. But many times, when someone commits one crime like this, they're bound to be a repeat offender, so it was worth a try. However, they got some devastating news. Remember that old way I told you about the RFLP? Well, it wouldn't be able to be read by their new system. That was so disappointing. They had an entirely new technique for DNA profiling. It was called STR, short tandem repeat. It's more accurate. So even though they had this full DNA profile, it would be like having something in a different language that couldn't be interpreted. It was obsolete, and therefore it was worthless to them. And not only that, the worst part was the old DNA testing method had used up the swab. That swab had been used to get the DNA from inside Jessica's body. It's like a long Q-tip that has a cotton part at the end. Well, it was used up and it was thrown away, so now they really didn't even have the killer's DNA. Several more years go by. It had been 15 years since Jessica's murder. Agent Costas literally resubmitted every piece of evidence, just crossing his fingers and hoping that something had usable DNA on it. Still, nothing. However, forensic scientist Max Larangiani was assigned to do whatever he could. There was a lot of pressure put on this man. He was told that this was the oldest unsolved case in their backlog, and it had no suspects. He really wished that the previous team hadn't used up that swab of semen, but then he finds something. When the original DNA vaginal swab was taken, it was stored in a vial, and even though the swab was completely gone, the bottle, the vial, it was still in their possession. Scientist Larangiani thought that this was a long shot, but perhaps some of the sperm had rubbed off on the sides or the bottom of this vial. So he took another sterile swab and he swabbed the inside all over. He knew that most likely it wouldn't yield anything, but he only needed a minuscule amount. He knew that in his hands, he had the vial that the original item was in contact with, but he was holding his breath. He was just hoping something would come up, but he wasn't expecting it, especially since this had been sitting in storage for 17 years by this time. He put what he swabbed onto a glass slide and looked at it under a microscope, and he said he actually gasped because there was a single sperm cell there. And that's all he needed. That is amazing. It is unbelievable. And now he has a DNA profile of the killer that they can actually enter into CODIS. Can you even imagine how that must have felt? But now they have to wait. At 10:11 a.m. on March 17th, 2008, 17 years to the exact day that Jessica Keene's body was found in that cemetery, Sheriff Sabin got a phone call saying that they got a hit on the DNA sample that they submitted. Sometimes it's almost as though there's some kind of unseen, powerful force besides science for this timing to be so perfect. But they have a name, Marvin Lee Smith Jr. It's a name of a person that has never been on their radar. They do a background check, and they find out Marvin had a history of violence, especially towards women. He had been convicted of the R-word, forced sexual intercourse, and many other criminal offenses in the past. And not only that, there was one crime that stood out to them. One of the offenses that Marvin had been convicted of was against a young woman that he picked up at a bus stop. Marvin fit the profile of the type of person that would have done this to Jessica. And guess what? On August 1991, just 5 months after Jessica's murder, Marvin had been sentenced to 3 years in the Ohio Correctional System at the London, Ohio facility. This was only 1.5 miles away from the Madison County Sheriff's Office and right next to the BCI building. So all that time when they were looking for the killer, he was essentially right there in such close proximity. But that was all before CODIS, and the states at the time didn't require DNA samples from inmates. He was incarcerated until 1995, and then he moved to North Carolina. He probably thought that he got away with it. But in April of 2000, he decided to violate his parole because he didn't want to attend counseling for sexual predators, so he was sent back to Ohio for 30 days. And at that time, they collected a DNA sample when he was incarcerated. So essentially, detectives could have gotten a hit years ago had the DNA sample in Jessica's case been retested back then, but they might not have had the same technology they did in 2008. By the time they got this hit, Marvin had definitely moved on in his life. He was married, had an infant son, and was working at Walmart in North Carolina. He definitely thought he got away with murder. It was easy to track him down. They found him outside his workplace on a smoke break, and they had a warrant for his arrest. They brought him back to Ohio for an interrogation. But knowing that Marvin Smith Jr. could easily claim that he had consensual sex with Jessica and that someone else killed her afterward, the detectives were very cautious about how they approached him. It's basically Agent Costas showing him a picture of Jessica. Of course, he denies knowing her, because this is like, okay, well then how does your semen get inside a woman that you say you've never met? What's the explanation? And Marvin says, I don't know. Costas says, well, we know based on scientific evidence that you had physical contact with this girl. And all Marvin could say was, I can't explain it. Costas was like, right, well the odds are literally 1 in 1 quintillion that someone else other than you had sexual relations with her and left the semen in there. To illustrate this, Costas takes a piece of paper and a pen and writes a 1 with 18 zeros after it. He holds it up and says, Marvin, do you know what this is? He says, that's a lot of zeros. That's when Costas told him, that's the odds that someone other than you left that semen in there. It's better than a fingerprint. It's scientific. And Marvin had nothing else to say. So on May 14th, 2008, a Madison County grand jury indicted him for aggravated murder, kidnapping, and rape. Investigators believe that on the evening of March 15th, Marvin asked Jessica if she needed a ride to the mall when she was sitting at that bus stop. And once she was inside his car, they think he went somewhere secluded, jumped in the back, and assaulted her numerous times over and over again in the next few hours. Then, at some point, he headed out to that rural area in Madison County and threw Jessica's clothing out the window on the way so that he could dispose of evidence. Jessica was probably aware that he was going to kill her. He may have even told her so. But Jessica managed to get away. She jumped out and ran. She was in an unfamiliar place in the middle of nowhere. It was dark and would have been hard for her to see anything. She ultimately jumped that fence in the cemetery, thinking it could have led to a home or a building, maybe a door that she could have gone through or a business. But she found herself in a cemetery, and she had to resort to hiding behind gravestones. And by the way, the one piece of duct tape that was hanging on Anthony Lee Taylor's grave, I looked him up, and he had died just a year before at the age of 17. To think that she was using another teen's grave as protection was really chilling and sad. If only she hadn't hit that post on that wire fence, maybe she could have gotten to that farmhouse in the distance, that beacon that called out to her in the darkness, that safe haven. But instead, she fell to her final resting place. Her mother hopes that that fall did render her unconscious, so that she didn't have to be aware of what Marvin, the monster, was doing to her. As the prosecution prepared for trial, they asked for the maximum sentence for Marvin, a death sentence. But Marvin Smith pleaded guilty to all charges just 1 month before trial was set to begin, taking a plea deal, sparing Jessica's family from going through the trial, leaving them with so many questions. Jessica's family had to accept that Marvin Smith Jr. would never have to explain why he killed Jessica. When they saw him in court for the very first time, they described him as non-emotional, scary, and it being an infuriating experience. They hoped to gain some closure, understanding about what happened, but instead they were just left with questions and a sense of loss. Before the judge sentenced Marvin Smith, Heather and Rebecca spoke on Jessica's behalf. Heather later said it was the most difficult thing she had ever done, but she felt compelled to do it because she wanted to be able to speak on Jessica's behalf, because she couldn't speak for herself. And even though Heather was scared and nervous, she was determined to do what she felt like was the right thing, to be her sister's voice in that courtroom. Rebecca was also overcome with emotion as she spoke to the judge, pleading for justice for her daughter. It was a difficult and emotional day for everyone, but Heather and Rebecca had to remain strong and speak for Jessica. Marvin Smith was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. I'm surprised that he has parole at all. Granted, I know he'll be in his 80s, but he shouldn't get 1 minute to enjoy life outside of a cell again. And while Jessica's family feels that justice has been served, the pain and sadness of their loss still lingers with them. Even in her dreams, Rebecca can still smell Jessica's hair and knows that Jessica will always be with her in her heart and in her memories. She'll never forget her. And in the end, Jessica's sister Heather said that she hoped that this case would give hope to other families that were waiting for justice in finding their loved ones' killers. It's possible, even years later, with modern technology. Sheriff Jim Sabin said that closing this case meant that when he decides to retire, he could retire in peace. When Marvin was sentenced, Jessica's family ripped off bracelets that they had been wearing for years in her memory. Heather wanted this moment to be symbolic, a symbol of the future for her traumatized family, especially her mom. Because Heather was a mom of 3 herself and a pediatric oncology nurse now, Heather said, "I'm a mother now, and I know how painful it was for Rebecca not to be there to protect Jessica and not to know what happened." She hoped this closure would bring peace to her mom, and that she could move on, and that it would help Heather to let go of the tragedy and the crime part of all this, and remember Jessica how she was. Heather also thanked Special Agent Costas, saying, "Ever since he took over the case and never let it go, she felt secure and confident that everything would be done that needed to be done." And Jessica's old friend wrote a thank you note to Costas. It said in part, "Marvin Smith taught me how to fear, and you taught me justice is always possible." It was a typical day for a 20-year-old hard-working young mother who cherished her family and her job. She wasn't even scheduled to work at Pizza Hut that morning, but a last-minute shift change brought her face to face with pure evil. The devastating tragedy that unfolded, and the investigation that followed, revealed how deeply corruption can seep, spreading like poison. Nancy Lena Lovelady DePriest is at the center of this case, but to do that, I have to take you way back to when her parents met for the first time. The year was 1967 when Eldwin Lovelady and Jeanette Popp met at the Clover Drive-In Theater in Fort Worth, Texas. Eldwin, who went by Eddie, was from Louisiana. He was a mechanic in the Air Force and had served in Vietnam. Jeanette grew up in Fort Worth with her 4 sisters. She was in a tough financial situation and was only 14, so her mother pushed her to get married to her next-door neighbor. Jeanette dropped out of high school and had her first child, Rita, at 15 years old, which was pretty tough. I know for young moms, it's really hard to balance the responsibility of motherhood and experiencing being a young person yourself. Jeanette's mom ended up raising Jeanette's daughter, Rita, while Jeanette dropped out of high school, got divorced from her neighbor husband, and started working. When she finally turned 18, she went to a drive-in movie, and that's when she spotted the most handsome man she had ever seen, Eddie. Eddie and Jeanette fell madly in love, and before they knew it, they were married. Jeanette was pregnant, and they were headed for Spokane, Washington, for Eddie's job. Eddie was a bit of a nomad. Even though he and Jeanette lived off base as a sergeant, he was always working and traveling to new places. Jeanette was a bookworm, but she spoke her mind and made friends very quickly. On March 4th, 1968, the couple gave birth to their first child, and that is the subject of this case today, the beautiful little Nancy. Just 14 months after she was born, her parents had her little brother, Eddie Jr., who was, of course, named after his father. Jeanette found it a struggle to raise kids at such a young age, but she did her very best. Unfortunately, when she heard a rumor that her husband, who was spending most of his time stationed in Japan at the time, had a girlfriend overseas and had been cheating on her, Jeanette got understandably upset. But instead of running away with the kids, Jeanette decided to leave everything behind, including her husband and their 2 children. It may not make sense to us, but we were not in Jeanette's shoes, and there's a turning point coming up, so be patient. Jeanette, like I said, was understandably very confused, angry, and of course felt betrayed. Eddie filed for divorce in August of 1973, and then he took 4-year-old Nancy and 3-year-old Eddie away to live with him in Japan. So, Nancy's first memories as a child were made in Japan, and I have to say that must have been a very fascinating experience. It's definitely on my bucket list. Nancy was forgiving, thoughtful, and generous, and I have to wonder if much of those values were instilled in her through Japanese culture and her spending all those years there with her father. But the family did move around a lot, and Nancy was back in the United States by the time she was 10 years old. She stayed in Louisiana for a little while, then San Antonio, and also Mountain Home, Idaho, where her dad chose to settle down and get remarried. He had 3 more children, Nancy's sisters, Jerry Lee, Wendy, and Beth. Now you may be wondering, whatever happened to Nancy's mom, Jeanette? Well, by that time, she had gotten both married and divorced again and had been working at Walmart, which she really liked for the discounts. Having their mother back in their lives was definitely not easy. Jeanette and her son, Eddie Jr., had a bit of a strained relationship. After all, Jeanette didn't spend time with her kids for several years. However, Nancy, as I said, had a very forgiving nature, and no matter the distance or time, she loved her mom more than anything. She believed in second chances and developed a very close relationship and friendship with her mother. Actually, in 1983, Nancy decided to move with her mom to Graham, Texas. Graham is a decent-sized town with a population of about 8,500 people, and when I look at Graham, all I can think of is stereotypical Texas. Lots of wilderness and recreational opportunities at Graham Lake, and it has the largest town square in all of America, believe it or not. Graham still has an operating drive-in theater. And I know that I've mentioned drive-ins twice now, so I have to ask, have you ever gone to one? I used to go when I was in high school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with my boyfriend at the time and our friends. I'll never forget hiding our friends in the trunk so they could get in for free. If you've never been to a drive-in, I think you should try it at least once if you can still find one. Jeanette's grandparents actually lived in Graham, and that's why Jeanette moved there. Now, living together, Nancy and her mom were like sisters. They were so close, they did everything together. Nancy and Jeanette were part of the Episcopal Church, and Nancy helped her mom out with the bills, getting her first job as a waitress and her second job at Pizza Hut. Nancy's brother followed her to Graham as well. Eddie loved his sister, even though he wasn't so close with their mother. Nancy spent high school working, studying, and even participating in some beauty pageants. She was stunning, an all-American Texas girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a gorgeous white smile. And of course, since it was the 80s, Nancy put a lot of effort into her hair, and you could tell she had those curled bangs that might have been held up with a little or a lot of hairspray. Not only was Nancy beautiful on the outside, she was beautiful on the inside. I know people say that, but Nancy was a people person. She was bubbly and outgoing, had so many friends, and would be laughing and chatting with a new friend every day. She loved to talk on the phone, and many of us still do, but not as much anymore. This was the landline era, when you just had one in your bedroom for talking and having fun, which she loved. If you invited her to anything, roller skating, hiking, bowling, Nancy was 100% down for it. She loved to ski and also liked to fish. It didn't really matter what the activity was, she just loved to keep herself busy, and she left a positive impact on the people she met. It was mid-February of Nancy's senior year of high school when she met a handsome man who swept her off her feet. His name was Anthony Todd DePriest. He went by Todd. He worked at a ranch about an hour away, with dreams of joining the Air Force. He was a few years older than Nancy. She had just turned 18 at the time, and Nancy came home raving about this new man and how she wanted to get married. So of course Jeanette was kind of like, slow down, and she freaked out because Nancy reminded her so much of herself when she was 18. Jeanette knew that it hadn't worked out between her and her husband at the time, so she didn't want Nancy making the same mistake. She hoped that Nancy would graduate high school and go to college before starting a family. But when Nancy wanted something, she did what she wanted. She loved Todd. So on her birthday, March 4th, she moved in with him in Granbury, which was about an hour-and-a-half drive away. On May 1st, 1986, they were married, and soon after that, Nancy graduated from high school. It was the definition of a whirlwind romance. Jeanette was left devastated. She struggled to accept that her daughter was married, but she knew the only way to keep a relationship with Nancy was to learn to like her man, Todd, and let Nancy make her own decisions, even if it meant living through mistakes. Some of us have to. But just because a person gets married young doesn't mean it's a mistake. The thing is, Todd didn't like Jeanette either, which was understandable, given the typical mother-in-law and son-in-law situation where the mother-in-law didn't fully support her daughter's choice. But Jeanette just wanted to protect her daughter. Nancy, however, was an adult, and when she found out she was pregnant with a baby girl, she felt completely blessed. That's one thing Jeanette knew Nancy wanted, though she didn't want Nancy to experience it this fast. Jeanette always knew Nancy wanted to be a mother. She even said that she thought Nancy was born to be a mother. She was just so loving and caring. Eventually, Todd was living his dream too. He got into the Air Force, landing a job as an aircraft maintenance specialist. By December of 1986, he and Nancy decided to move to Austin, Texas, where he could work on the base, and she could get a job through Pizza Hut. She had been working there for a long time and moving up the ranks, planning to work for corporate one day. They moved into an apartment at 2000 Cedar Bend Drive in North Austin, Texas. While the big city was an adjustment, Nancy absolutely fell in love with it, but especially, she fell in love with her Pizza Hut community. There were 23 Pizza Huts in that area alone, and some people worked at multiple restaurants hopping around. They even had Pizza Hut softball tournaments. Nancy worked at 3 different locations in 2 years, and she felt like the people she met were like a second family to her. Nancy welcomed her daughter into the world in July of 1987, right in the middle of the hot, muggy, sticky Austin heat. She named her Slivia DePriest. Slivia was born with a thick head of dark hair, just like her dad. They looked like twins in a picture with Nancy, and Nancy was so in love. She talked about Todd and Slivia constantly. They were always on her mind. She had a dream that once Slivia was a toddler and old enough to walk, she was going to buy her one of those little motorized Corvettes, like the Power Wheels ones. In April of 1988, Nancy started working for the Pizza Hut near I-35 at 1011 Rainy Street. Nancy was working as an assistant manager. She showed all of her co-workers pictures of her family, and everyone knew she loved her life. I can't say this for everyone in management positions, but Nancy was a great manager, and she was happy with her job. She was caring and understanding as a supervisor, and she went out of her way to help others. By October of 1988, Nancy was 20 years old. Her baby daughter was just over a year old, 15 months to be exact, and Nancy had a routine. She would spend the mornings taking care of her daughter and the evenings managing the Raleigh Street Pizza Hut. When she wasn't working on the weekends, she would spend her time with Todd. I mentioned that Pizza Hut had a softball league. Well, Nancy was one of their most dedicated players. It wasn't that she actually loved softball, she wasn't really a softball person, but she loved events and absolutely loved connecting with people. As I said, she was truly a people person and just genuinely nice to everyone. That's why being on the team was something she dedicated much of her time to. That's actually the reason she had to switch her shift on Monday, October 24th. She was supposed to be working Monday night on the 24th, but that conflicted with a softball game. So she asked one of the managers to switch the AM and PM shifts, and she asked her babysitter to take Slivia that morning. Nancy woke up on the 24th, put her work clothes on, and made the 13-minute drive to Pizza Hut with baby Slivia in her car. Whenever both Nancy and Todd had to be somewhere, Todd would do what he did that morning. He'd follow behind Nancy on his motorcycle. Of course, they needed the car seat for Slivia, and they only had one car. Todd would switch to the car after Nancy was dropped off at work. Then, he would take the baby to the sitter, bring Nancy's car back to her workplace, and leave on his motorcycle. It sounds complicated, but this was just one of their routines. When they arrived at Pizza Hut, it was 7 a.m. Todd left his motorcycle in the parking lot, took Nancy's keys, drove Slivia to the babysitter, then came back to the Pizza Hut to get his motorcycle. He arrived back around 7:40 a.m. He knocked on the employee door of Pizza Hut, gave Nancy her car keys, and gave her a kiss goodbye. Then he drove away on his motorcycle in the direction of the Air Force Base, not knowing that that was the last time he would ever see his wife alive. It's always so shocking for me to think about that part, because you just never know. You may wonder why Nancy was getting to work so early when Pizza Hut doesn't open until 11 a.m. It's more of a lunchtime and dinner spot. Well, Nancy needed extra time because she needed to open the store, go through all the checks from the night before, and start making the pizza dough. It was part of the morning shift and the responsibility of the key holders like herself. Even though Nancy was all alone in the restaurant, all the doors were locked, so Nancy was completely safe. But when Nancy's general manager called her at 8:30 that morning to do their Monday morning check-in, she didn't answer. That was a little odd because Nancy was usually a very responsible and responsive employee. Perhaps she was just busy, so he waited a few minutes and phoned her again, but Nancy still didn't respond. By 9:30 that morning, when her boss still couldn't get a hold of her, he began to get worried. The store had to be opened on time, and of course he was also concerned about why Nancy wouldn't be answering after calling her again and again for the past hour. That wasn't normal. He decided to head over to the restaurant, wondering if maybe Nancy forgot that she had switched to the morning shift, or if she was just running behind or busy. When he arrived, he noticed something unusual right away. The employee door was not locked. Usually, this door is locked until normal business hours. What this meant to him was that Nancy had made it to the restaurant and unlocked the door, but he wondered why she seemingly hadn't locked it behind her once she made it inside. Upon first glance around the dining area when he stepped in, he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary until he took his first few steps further inside. That's when he became concerned and confused. The restaurant floor was covered in water. It was about an inch deep all over. It looked like the place had been completely flooded. So what happened? He called out to Nancy. He didn't get a response. As he stepped deeper into the restaurant, he could see and hear that the dough machine was still running in the prep kitchen, which meant that Nancy was there. But where was all the water coming from? And where was she? The manager knew something wasn't right. He walked towards the counter, which faced the front of the store, past the counter, and went around the corner. That's when he realized the water seemed to be coming from the men's restroom. When he opened the door, he realized why Nancy wasn't answering. He saw her bare, unclothed body lying beneath the sink. This was a horrible sight for him to see. She was clearly unresponsive, bleeding from her head, her blonde hair stained red. He knew it was Nancy right away. Her eyes were still open, but it was like she couldn't see him. She was just staring blankly. The manager rushed back outside to alert the authorities. Rookie cop officer Scott Ahart from the Austin PD was dispatched, along with his partner. When they arrived and got inside, they also saw all the water on the floor. They noticed there was more of it, in higher concentration, near the restrooms, which made sense. They made their way into the men's restroom, where the water seemed to be pouring out. When they opened the door, they saw the woman lying inside. As Officer Ahart quickly looked around, taking everything in, he saw what he described as spots of coagulated blood in the water next to her. He could tell that she was tied up with her bra, and it appeared as though she had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. By the initial appearance of everything, Officer Ahart thought she was deceased. But then, all of a sudden, he saw what he thought was her breathing. As he got closer, he realized she was still alive. He started talking to her, trying to get her to respond, but she didn't. All she could do was gasp for air. Of course, they radioed for emergency services, and they rushed Nancy to Brackenridge Hospital. She was in very critical condition and not expected to survive. Medical personnel quickly began working to try to save Nancy's life. She underwent emergency surgery before they even had a chance to officially identify her. Her family was unaware that this normal day at work had turned so deadly. Imagine her mother, her husband, going about their day as usual, unaware that any of this was happening. Notification would have to wait. The hospital's first priority was to do what they could to save their patient's life. Meanwhile, investigators from the Austin Police Department had been called out to the Pizza Hut. Once there, they immediately began processing the crime scene as though it were a homicide. They started putting crime scene tape up, and the Pizza Hut was closed to the public for the foreseeable future. First, they wanted to look into the cause of the flooding, which became obvious once they examined the men's room. Stuffed into the sink, plugging the drain, was a blue apron. The faucet was still running, and the water had overflowed onto the floor, causing part of the restaurant to flood. It was highly unlikely that Nancy had been washing her clothes. This was clearly an attempt by the perpetrator to wash away all the evidence. Right near the toilet on the ground, there appeared to be a pair of khaki pants and light blue underwear crumpled on the ground. The lid to the garbage bin was on top of them. Nearby was a white button-down dress shirt, which appeared to have blood on it. It seemed that these were Nancy's clothes. Her bra had been used by the assailant to tie her hands behind her back, and it was still on her when she was taken away from the scene. The person who did this had tried to get rid of all the evidence, but there was something obvious they left behind: a single .22 caliber shell casing, which was submerged under the water right next to where Nancy had been lying. All this evidence was collected and taken back to the crime lab for analysis. Even though it was the 80s, even the late 80s, it was a lot different back then, nothing close to what we can accomplish today. Considering Nancy was nude, the investigators assumed this was a male perpetrator, and they believed she was most likely sexually violated. At this point, they went through the Pizza Hut looking for signs of a struggle. When they looked at the lock on the door, it was completely intact. There was no sign of a break-in, so they began to wonder, had Nancy let her attacker inside? Did she know them? Or maybe they followed her inside, overpowering her as she entered. Or did this person have a key? There was one sign of a struggle. They found a single strand of hair in an area of the restaurant where customers waited for their pizzas and played arcade games. The hair was missing its root, which would make it really hard to identify through DNA analysis, but it was still the best evidence they had. I'm wondering how they knew that a single hair in a restaurant frequented by so many people would be related to this crime. Next, the investigators checked the cash register, wondering if this was a robbery. That year, there had been a string of robberies in Austin, and criminals were actually targeting Pizza Huts. I'm not sure how much money Pizza Huts usually keep in store, but it was the 80s, and lots of people were paying in cash. In the 4 robberies, no one had been hurt, and all those robberies had occurred in the late afternoon or early evening. so it seemed unlikely that this was connected. But when they checked the floor safe in the back of the restaurant, it was open. It's where employees would deposit their nightly cash, usually in a bank bag, but not in this case. It seemed to be missing. They checked the receipts, and there was exactly $150 in cash unaccounted for. Of course, this was enough to raise a red flag, but they wondered, would this warrant taking Nancy's life? Maybe she could have identified the robber, and they decided this was the only way to silence her. Or maybe Nancy was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sadly, Nancy wasn't doing well at all. They had done all they could to try to save her life. She was the only witness, and they were hoping she would somehow make it, not only so she could tell them who did this, but because investigators had learned she was a mother and a wife, and they were so saddened by what they had witnessed. She was so young and had so much life to live. Unfortunately, Nancy was in a coma, clinging to life. She was put on life support while her loved ones were contacted so they could say their last goodbyes. Todd was at the Air Force Base when he got the call that Nancy was in the hospital. It was a moment of sheer panic. He had just seen her that morning. How was she now on life support? He dropped everything and drove his motorcycle to the hospital. When he was given the information about Nancy's condition, he called Jeanette. Jeanette and Eddie Jr. had just moved to a tiny home in Cedar Creek Lake, and it didn't even have a landline yet. Jeanette had spent the whole day going to convenience stores looking for jobs, so she didn't get home until 4 p.m. p.m. That's when her landlord knocked on her door and told her she had an emergency call. Jeanette picked up the phone asking, "What's the matter?" Todd said, "It's Nancy." There was so much fear in his voice that Jeanette knew something was wrong. Jeanette asked, "Is she okay?" She was freaking out at this point. Todd said, "There's been a robbery and she's been shot." Jeanette asked how badly she was hurt, and that's when Todd broke down crying. Between sobs, he told Jeanette that Nancy was on life support and probably wouldn't make it, and that the hospital staff had given him the go-ahead to pull the plug whenever he felt ready. Jeanette, of course, was distraught. She was hysterical and just screamed, but in her heart she knew that Nancy would not want to live in that state, unable to truly live. She agreed with Todd to take her off life support, but begged him to wait until she could be by Nancy's side. He told her he would. Jeanette was 3.5 hours away and not immediately able to get a ride. While Todd stayed by his wife's side, Jeanette couldn't get there until early the next morning. At 10:45 that night, the doctors pronounced that Nancy had irreversible damage. They could keep her on life support, but unfortunately, her wounds were so severe that the moment she was taken off, she would die. Right after Jeanette arrived, she kissed Nancy and told her goodbye. It was hard to turn off that machine, knowing that was the end. Nancy was an organ donor, so through her tragic murder, she was able to help several people who needed transplants. She was able to donate her heart, liver, both of her kidneys, and her bone marrow. This procedure honors and respects the donor while harvesting their organs. It takes between 24 to 36 hours to complete. Afterward, professionals are still able to move forward with things like an autopsy and funeral arrangements, which would come very soon. Right after Nancy was pronounced dead, her case was officially labeled a homicide investigation. A homicide detective, Hector Polanco, was assigned as the lead on the case. He was notorious for being quick and dirty with his investigations. He did whatever he could to always close his cases and get a confession. They were counting on him. Detective Polanco talked to the general manager, who had been the one to find Nancy that morning. He had a good alibi and was ruled out as a suspect, but he was able to provide important information about the standard routine for Pizza Hut managers and shift leaders like Nancy, who had a master key to access all the stores, not just that location. This meant that key holders could walk into any Pizza Hut in Austin, Texas. There was now a very large pool of people Polanco needed to interview who could have targeted Nancy. First, they wanted to rule out everyone who worked at the Riley location, and then move on to other stores. At the same time, their prime suspect was actually Nancy's husband, Todd, the one who had just pulled the plug. However, his alibi checked out quickly. Investigators were going with the theory that Nancy knew her attacker. She was so reliable that she wouldn't have let just anyone inside the restaurant unless they were familiar to her or were a fellow employee. It was also relayed to Polanco that Nancy had called a produce company around 8:30. A man spoke to someone there to make an order for some items for the restaurant. That was the last time anyone had heard from her, so they had a time frame between 8:30 a.m. and just before 10 a.m. when her manager found her. By the next morning, Nancy's case was already all over the Texas news. Officer Polanco did his best not to reveal any details of the case to the public, hoping to catch the perpetrator by what they knew about the crime. Nancy had been such a bright, nurturing young mother, and though very few people knew how badly she'd been hurt, they wanted the person who did this to be behind bars. There was already so much pressure being put on authorities. That year, there had been 45 homicides, and there were no crime scene investigators back then. Homicide detectives did everything. There were only 6 of them, and they were burning out. It was not an easy task. They had to go to all the crime scenes at any hour, day or night. They'd be called in and would have to immediately stop what they were doing and rush over, sometimes working on more than one case at a time. They processed the crime scene, submitted all the evidence, and hand-wrote their notes and reports. It was a lot, and many of them were working 48-hour shifts with no sleep. You have one job as a homicide detective, to solve the murder. Their goal is to close every single case, and if they don't, they're seen as a failure. Their job depends on figuring it out, and there's a lot of pressure from outside the force as well. The victim's family is calling in every day, asking for updates on the progress of the case, and it hardly seems like it's ever moving fast enough, especially back then, not to mention how scared the community becomes. This means that detectives like Polanco are in a hurry to figure things out. He wasted no time and began interviewing every employee at the Riley location. Just days later, by October 27th, he had interviewed every single person on the staff. Each one seemed to have adored Nancy, and Polanco was understandably frustrated because he had no viable suspects yet. He told all the employees to report any suspicious behavior that they witnessed going forward to the Austin PD. Soon after this, Nancy's autopsy results came back from the Travis County Medical Examiner's office. She had an entrance wound 3.5 inches above her left ear. Her hair was shaved in this location to get a closer look at the surface of the wound. There was no stippling present, which meant that the gun was not close up when it was shot, but more of what was described in the report as a distant type wound. The projectile went through her skull, through the brain, from the back to the front, toward the front orbital area, and was lodged inside. They were able to retrieve a mushroom .22 caliber lead bullet, which was preserved and sent over to Sergeant Hector Polanco on October 26, 88 at 9:40 a.m. The next part of this report confirmed investigators' fears about Nancy being violated by a male perpetrator. For the manner of death, the report reads, "It is my opinion, based on the investigation of the circumstances and findings at autopsy, that the decedent, Nancy Lena Day Priest, came to her death as a result of a gunshot wound of the head, distant type, associated with sexual assault. It was ruled a homicide." The semen sample was sent to the lab for DNA processing, which, by the way, was limited. They used to call it DNA fingerprinting back then. It had nothing to do with fingerprints. It was just mapping of the DNA, and it had just been introduced that year in forensic cases. First, it's always great to be able to say deoxyribonucleic acid, which is abbreviated as DNA. DNA testing started with paternity testing in the 80s, and then they realized we get 50% of our DNA from our father and the other half from our mother. This advanced into being used as a forensic tool. However, 99.9% of human DNA sequences are the same in every single human being, but there are parts of our DNA that are of course unique to each of us, except for identical twins. The analysis would isolate that part of the DNA. Back in 1988, though, the science relied heavily on blood typing, and as you're probably aware, many of us have the same blood type. There are only 4 main blood types: A, B, AB, and O. You can have a combination of those, so there are 8 different blood types. Blood type doesn't lend much to telling what we look like, so it's not exactly a reliable tool when figuring out who your suspects are. Back then, if somebody was killed and had, let's say, a blood type of O, and they found other blood on the scene, let's say from the attacker who had a different type of blood, then maybe they'd be looking for someone with that blood type since it's different from the victim's. That's how they could rule out a suspect. If somebody had a different blood type than what they found on the scene, and it wasn't the victim's, that would be seen as more likely to be found at crime scenes than blood. So they began using that to extract DNA, but back then they used restriction fragment length polymorphism. You've probably seen this before, maybe you don't remember the name of it, but it looks like this. It's when lines are compared in 2 samples, and if they are the same, then they conclude the same person was there. If not, it's not a match. The point is, it wasn't the most accurate science back then. Plus, you needed a sample of a suspect's DNA to test and compare to what you found, so the detectives had to do the real boots-on-the-ground investigation before this could even come into play. That meant isolating someone as their prime suspect. It wasn't long before the Riley location pizza was back in business, but now they had hired a new security guard named Lorenzo. Everyone was scared there would be another robbery and someone else could be hurt, so Lorenzo actually stood guard at the front door and monitored the restaurant and the patrons inside and outside. Remember when the investigators told the employees to call them if they saw anything suspicious? Well, let's fast forward to November 9th. A little after 2 weeks from when Nancy was killed, Austin PD got a call from the night manager at the Rainy Pizza location. She said that 2 young men had come into the restaurant. They pulled into the parking lot and just sat there with their headlights shining toward the restaurant for about 5 minutes. Then they went inside, sat down, and ordered 2 beers. They were just sitting there, sipping their beers while scanning the restaurant in silence for a while. Then they clinked their beer mugs together. What was weird was what they were overheard saying by the security guard. They were toasting in Nancy's memory. But as far as the night manager knew, these guys didn't know Nancy personally, so why were they even there? They were happily at the scene where her murder took place, making a toast, which raised a red flag. But there was more. Lorenzo was on duty that night, and one of the young men approached him, asking why he was acting like a security guard. The guy introduced himself as Richard and started asking about Nancy, whether it was true that she was found near the cash register, and if the police had identified any suspects. He also wanted to know if Nancy had been shot. When Lorenzo said that was classified information, Richard speculated that 2 people might be responsible. Lorenzo was getting creeped out now, so he asked Richard who he was and where he was at the time of the murder. Richard replied that he worked at the North Lamar Pizza Hut and was opening that store at the same time that Nancy was killed. Then the 2 men left before they had even finished their beers. Well, that was another red flag. Richard worked at another Pizza Hut location and opened, which meant he had a master key. The night manager from the Rainy location reported all of this suspicious behavior to the police, who made note of everything. Sergeant Borman of the Austin PD followed up with Lorenzo to see what he knew about the 2 men in the restaurant and Nancy's death. Lorenzo had not heard what type of bullet was found in Nancy's body, and he also didn't know what items of clothing had caused the bathroom to flood, or any specifics about the crime scene. Then Sergeant Borman started looking into Richard from the North Lamar Pizza Hut, and this is what he found. Richard Danziger was 18 years old. He worked at both the Red Lobster and the North Lamar Pizza Hut location. He had just started dating his manager Donna, and in September his roommate Christopher Okoa was a line cook at the Pizza Hut on Guadalupe Street. Christopher was 22 years old, and definitely the guy who had gone with Richard to make that toast in Nancy's memory. This meant that all 3 of them were employees who knew the layout of Pizza Hut, and 2 of them had master keys. Borman had a feeling that Richard and Christopher were somehow involved and wondered if Nancy might have known them, since remember, she bounced between different restaurants in the Austin area and played on the Pizza Hut softball team. Had Richard or Christopher maybe targeted Nancy? Had they tried to rob the store and didn't know that Nancy was going to be there that morning? Or were they just innocently having a drink at a location? Sergeant Borman figured out the address to Richard and Christopher's apartment, which they shared with Richard's brother, Ralph, and a roommate named Roger Lewis. Richard and Christopher weren't home at the time, so Sergeant Borman found Donna's address. On Friday, November 11th, he paid her a visit. When he arrived, her boyfriend Richard was sitting on the couch. Borman asked Richard if he would mind coming outside and talking to him for a moment. Richard agreed. Outside, Borman explained that he was investigating Nancy DePriest's murder and hoped that Richard would come into the police station and give a statement. That's when the story gets strange. This is from the records of the investigators involved. At this point, there were Sergeant Borman, Detective Polanco, and Detective Sergeant Edward Balaja. The report noted that Richard pointed through the door in Donna's direction, saying, "That's my alibi," pointing to his girlfriend. He explained he was asleep at the time that Nancy was murdered. But didn't he initially say to Lorenzo that he had been opening up the North Lamar location that morning? Sergeant Borman asked Richard to come back with him to the station, where he took turns interviewing Richard with Detective Polanco. Richard said he heard that Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber gun, and that the perpetrator had stuffed a blue apron in the women's restroom to flood the store and erase evidence. The investigators were pretty shocked. They didn't know how he could have known that. Lorenzo, the security guard closer to the case, hadn't even known those details. Richard claimed he heard it from Donna's supervisor, the general manager of the North Lamar store. But Borman already had that supervisor's number on speed dial. He left the room, called them up, and asked them what color the apron was that was found in the restroom. The supervisor said they didn't know. So how did Richard know these details? This was not looking good for him. Borman told Richard that nobody could have possibly known that information unless they had been at the crime scene. Richard denied that he was ever there. He wasn't fessing up. Later that night, Sergeant Balaja questioned him, and Balaja asked Richard what he could tell him about the murder at Pizza Hut. The same questions again. Richard claimed he didn't know anything. He said he had an alibi. He said that on the night of October 23rd, he and his friend Christopher bought some beer, went to Donna's house at 10 p.m., and that Donna was ironing in the kitchen. So Christopher and Richard just hung out and played cards. They invited some of Donna's friends to play a drinking game with them around 11 p.m. Then Christopher was getting tired, so he left. But within minutes, he said Christopher came back to the apartment, saying that his car key was broken. So they called Roger, their other roommate, to come get him at 2 a.m., the early morning hours when Nancy was shot. Roger and Christopher left together, and Richard spent the night at his girlfriend Donna's house. Richard said that he and Donna were pretty drunk at that point, and that he knew he had to get to work by 8 o'clock in the morning. But he passed out, and before he knew it, it was 9:30 and he was late. He said that Donna got a phone call from the North Lamar Pizza Hut. It was the morning manager contacting them to try to find Richard. As soon as Donna hung up, Richard got ready and rushed out to Pizza Hut after 10 a.m. Interesting, was he really sleeping? Or was he over at the Riley location violating and killing Nancy? So this was Richard's alibi, his girlfriend. He hadn't even answered Donna's phone, so the morning shift manager wouldn't be able to confirm that he was really there. Donna could be covering for him. Richard allegedly told Sergeant Balaja, "You don't have any evidence that would link me to this crime." When Balaja suggested that Richard's explanation of the night made him sound guilty of capital murder, Richard said, "You're not going to pin a capital murder on me." But why did he know about the .22 caliber bullet and the blue work apron? However, it's true there was no direct evidence against him, so he was released, and the police did not write an official statement from him at this point. On the same day, November 11th, while Richard was being interrogated, Christopher was working at the Guadalupe Pizza Hut. When Sergeant Borman and a woman detective pulled him aside, they explained they wanted to question him about the murder of Nancy DePriest. Christopher, just like Richard, was like, "Sure." He offered to drive himself to the station, but the detectives said they wanted him to come in a police car. Christopher had no idea that the police had been called when he and Richard made that toast to Nancy and that they were suspects. Once at the station, Sergeant Borman asked Christopher a few questions about the murder while they were sitting in a cubicle. Then they moved him into an interview room. Borman then left, and another detective came in and introduced himself as Sergeant Polanco. He told Christopher that on the streets, they called him El Diablo. For context, Sergeant Polanco and Christopher both spoke Spanish as their first language. El Diablo means the devil, which in the context of an interview room at a police station could be a bit threatening. Recall that I told you Polanco had this reputation for closing his cases fast and dirty, and one reason is because he didn't play nicely. If you can think of good cop, bad cop, he'd be the bad cop. It didn't take long for him to use this scare tactic to intimidate Christopher. Polanco pounded his fist on the table and even started yelling. Christopher appeared to be shocked. Polanco told Christopher that if he knew who hurt Nancy, he needed to tell them the truth. If Christopher didn't tell the truth, he'd be charged with capital murder and given the death penalty, which in Texas is a common sentence. Christopher told him he did not know who did this. After a while, Polanco switched tactics and left the room. There are actually a lot of interesting interrogation tactics utilized by investigators. One is to leave the suspect alone and record them to see if they say anything out of the ordinary. At this time, it wasn't commonplace to have video and audio recording going on, but the tactic of making them sweat, so to speak, can work, and you can get a confession. Sergeant Balaja was the one who had been interviewing Richard, and he came in playing the good cop. They were utilizing this well-known tactic. Balaja apologized to Christopher, saying, "I'm so sorry for my hot-headed partner." He said Christopher could go home as long as he was telling them the truth. Again, Christopher pushed back, insisting he didn't know anything. Then Balaja left and Polanco came back in. Christopher was not under arrest, but he also hadn't requested an attorney, so the questioning continued. I want to remind everyone, you should always remain silent and ask for an attorney if you're being questioned. It's your right. It's your right to remain silent, so use it. Bano asked Christopher about his alibi. Christopher said that at 8 a.m., he was asleep in the apartment that he shared with Roger, Richard, and Ralph. He said he did remember that around maybe 8:30 that morning, he heard Roger talking in the room next to him on the phone with one of the pizza managers, and said that Richard was spending the night at Donna's. Polanco wasn't sure if that was the truth. He left, and Bala entered. This went on for hours. Hours. It was all they had to go on. They had to get to the bottom of it. Polanco returned and reminded Christopher once again that this was a death penalty state, and they were hoping it would break him down. Christopher said he didn't do anything, and begged Polanco to please believe him. Then Balaja came back in, and Christopher said he only knew what he told them because he saw it on the news. Polanco showed Christopher a picture of death row and promised he would never get a chance to hug his family again. But still, Christopher told him he didn't know anything. That's when Polanco said he knew that Christopher didn't have a criminal history, that he was an honor student, and he came from a hard-working family. He had no history of violence, and that meant he must be covering for his friend Richard. He needed to come clean. If not, they would both go down for this crime and be put to death by lethal injection. When Polanco used the scare tactic to elicit shock, he showed Christopher an autopsy picture of Nancy. He asked, "Don't you feel bad for her?" and urged Christopher to confess who did this. Polanco thought that Christopher had maybe seen everything happen and blocked it out of his memory. He was just trying to get Christopher to remember how he was involved, or maybe he was just trying to protect Richard. Maybe he didn't want to rat out his longtime friend. So Polanco said that Richard was in the next room and was ready to put all the blame on Christopher. Another tactic: pit one suspect against the other, hoping that one of them will break. The detective went on to explain that Richard was probably going to walk free because he was a white guy, and white guys always got the better end of the stick. He told Christopher, It's time for a minority to have the chance to win. Christopher still claimed he didn't know anything. Polano left and came back, saying when Christopher goes to jail, he would be fresh meat for all the other inmates. Well, they were well into the interview at this point. Christopher thought he was going to be sent to jail. They interviewed him for 20 hours over the course of 2 days. He was exhausted, he hadn't seen the sun in hours, and he just wanted to go home. That's when he started to crack. He was ready to make a statement. His story changed, which is never a good sign. Detective Blanco pulled out a typewriter and asked if Christopher was involved in the crime. Christopher said yes, but admitted Richard was the mastermind. Christopher ended up confessing that he was the accomplice, but it gets crazier. If this was simple, I would not be sharing this case. It's wild. After typing out Christopher's horrific recollection of what he and Richard did to poor Nancy, Christopher was finally ready to go home. He really thought he was going to just go home after this. Of course, Balaja said he couldn't let him leave because he had to give them hair, blood, and semen samples. Christopher agreed, and they went to the hospital and took all the samples they needed. Do they take semen samples? I always thought they took regular DNA and just used the semen to extract the DNA. I don't know, this was the 80s. They did a lot of things back then. Christopher agreed, and they went to the hospital. They took the samples, but they still needed a warrant to arrest him, and they weren't actually done talking to him. But they weren't ready to take him to jail either. They actually got a hotel for Christopher for the weekend as they sorted through all the gruesome details of Nancy's murder. They tried to explain to Christopher that since he made this statement against his friend Richard, it really wouldn't be a good idea to go back to the apartment they shared. What if Richard came after him? At this point, Christopher was so exhausted, he just agreed to whatever. He stayed at the hotel, but did call Roger and asked, "Do you have a number for a lawyer?" Well, on Monday, November 14th, Balaja and Polano came to the hotel and took Christopher back to the police station. Polano had found out that Christopher called Roger looking for an attorney, so now Polano had more reason to suspect that these guys were guilty. If the confession wasn't enough, just so you know, getting a lawyer is not evidence of guilt. At the station, they began the next half of Christopher's interrogation. He even agreed to a recorded statement. At first, he said on tape that Richard had gone inside to rob the Pizza Hut, and Christopher waited outside the entire time. But then they made him take a polygraph test. When the investigators came back, they told him he failed. But as we know, polygraphs are not a great indication of whether or not someone is truly lying. They're just kind of a scare tactic. Polano told Christopher that he thought Christopher was inside the Pizza Hut when Nancy was killed, and that Christopher was the one who shot Nancy, even though Richard was the one who had the idea in the first place. If he confessed his guilt, they could reduce his sentence from death and give Christopher 60 years in prison instead. That's when Christopher said yes and confessed to everything in the police's statement. Christopher said he and Richard had planned to rob the Rainy Street Pizza Hut while they were playing cards at Donna's house. Christopher didn't want to do it, but Richard asked Christopher for his help, and that was his best friend. He finally agreed. Richard told Christopher that he would invite Roger over, and Christopher could go home with him, and then Richard could stay at Donna's. Therefore, both of them would have alibis. At 7 a.m., the two of them met up at McDonald's, which they did. Richard showed up with a gun in his pants, driving his girlfriend's car. They parked their cars at a nearby apartment complex across the street and watched Nancy get dropped off outside the Pizza Hut around 7:30 and go inside. That's when they used Donna's key to open the side door. Inside, Nancy was preparing dough. She saw Christopher and said, "What's up, Christopher?" That's when Richard told Nancy to shut up and show him the money. He threatened her at gunpoint, and Nancy gave him the money from the safe. That's when Richard promised to have fun and proceeded to violate her in multiple places around the restaurant. Richard then instructed Christopher to tie her up and to also have some fun with her. Polano wrote that Christopher said they did this to her 8 times while Nancy begged for them to stop. Then Richard said that they would have to kill Nancy because she could recognize them. Richard then shot Nancy in the head, and both of them proceeded to violate her again before putting her clothes in the sink to wash away all the evidence. Christopher signed the statement in front of witnesses. I am truly shocked by how brutal that story was. But wait, because you haven't even heard the details. Those details come out at trial, and it is just unreal. But there were some inconsistencies, like the timing. Remember that Todd said he came back with his motorcycle, and that the last time he saw Nancy was not when she was originally dropped off? There's a little bit of a discrepancy there because they said that they went in and started doing this to her after she got dropped off. But the thing is, we know she saw her husband, so that wasn't exactly a good time frame. They also wanted to know why Richard and Christopher decided not to relock the Pizza Hut door if they had the key. Did they just forget, or were they in a rush? And was there any evidence that Nancy knew Christopher and Richard? Did they engage in intercourse, and how many times? If they only found one hair at the scene, there was also that call to the produce company at 8:30. But it's true. Sometimes criminals don't exactly have time to look at their watches. They have more important things at hand. Right after Sergeant Balaja had sat through this confession, he called and told his brother that he had just interviewed the devil himself, that Christopher had dead eyes, and he had never been in the presence of someone so cold before in his life. I know I haven't gone into the details about this confession. We will get there. But the gist of it was that it all started as a robbery and escalated when they realized that Nancy could identify them, so they had to kill her. Christopher was arrested on November 14th, but now it was up to a jury to decide whether the evidence existed that matched up with this confession. I told you much more would come at trial on November 15th. Christopher's partner in crime, Richard, was visiting his family when he was also arrested. He provided blood, hair, semen, and saliva samples, and he and Christopher were both charged with capital murder. But here's the thing. In Texas, a confession is not enough evidence to convict someone of murder. There has to be evidence tying the confession to the truth. There just wasn't yet. They had to prove that the hair and the bullet shell found at the scene belonged to either Richard or Christopher. But these tests take time. As for Nancy's family, Jeanette found out Christopher and Richard were in jail, and she felt a sense of relief. Alanko told her he had no doubt he had found the men who had done this to her daughter, and that the confession was shocking. That was really hard for her to hear. It was bad enough to imagine what Nancy went through, but to know the truth was horrific. It was a lot to take in. Actually, since Nancy's murder, Jeanette had been depressed. She exhibited signs of self-harm. She was smoking 4 packs of cigarettes every day, and she lost 30 pounds. Her sister had to slap her across the face and say that she needed to take care of herself and her grief, transforming her self-hatred over Nancy's death into hatred for the two people who did this. Knowing that they were behind bars didn't mean she was able to move on, but justice was going to be served. Nancy's death left a huge hole in the lives of Todd, her daughter Slivia, Jeanette, Eddie, and Eddie Jr. No one could believe something like this could happen to someone like Nancy. On November 21st, Christopher and Richard had their bond hearings. At the hearing, the defense argued they could not be held in jail without bond, unless the prosecution provided evidence that a jury would be able to convict them. The prosecution said there was no evidence, so they were held without bond. Each of them could have paid the bond, but it was $100,000 each, so they were going to stay in jail. Now they had to wait for the Texas Department of Public Safety to process the DNA of the semen and the hair found at the crime scene. When the results came back, Todd was ruled out as a suspect. They had to do this even though he had an alibi because spouses are usually involved somehow. But this time, Todd's semen and hair did not match up. Richard's semen sample also came back negative, which means that even though Christopher confirmed that Richard had violated Nancy multiple times, Richard likely didn't, or maybe he didn't finish, so to speak. But it was Christopher's DNA that came back unconfirmed. He was the one that could not be eliminated. In 1988, as I tried to explain, It was possible that, if someone had the same blood type as Nancy, her blood group markers would hide the perpetrator's DNA. It's a very tricky analytical process because the Texas department could not differentiate the samples. They sent it to the Forensic Science Associates. The DNA analyst, Edward Blake, said that because of Christopher's DQ alpha markers, which he shared with 16% of the Mexican-American population, his semen sample could not be ruled out. Now let me tell you about that hair. Back then, they did visual comparisons. We're talking not too scientific here, although they did look at them under a microscope. The hair was found at the scene and compared to Nancy's, but by comparison, it was ruled out. It did not belong to her. Christopher's head and pubic hair did not match up either, but when it was compared to Richard's pubic hair, it was consistent. The hair's color and texture were similar enough that it pointed to him as a suspect. But remember, they didn't have the root. They weren't able to test it for actual DNA. And I'm not trying to go all TMI here, but comparing pubic hair, I'm pretty sure you know what I'm thinking. How many different styles are there? Please don't Google it. Apparently there are 4 basic ones. Look at the screen if you're interested in learning something new today, because I did. They're called terminal hairs, and they're obviously a different texture than our scalp hair, as we know. But anyway, in preparation for the trial, Christopher's defense attorney, Nate STK, sat down with him to go over his case. Christopher wanted to somehow make a deal to get a lighter sentence, and insisted he was actually innocent. Shockingly, his own attorney wasn't buying it. The attorney explained that based on the brutality of his confession and his DNA results being inconclusive, it was clear he was guilty. The only way he was going to avoid death was by pleading guilty and then testifying against his roommate, Richard. That was his best chance. At that point, the DNA testers even reached out to Christopher's attorney to ask if they wanted another DNA test, and the attorney said no. He stated there was no chance Christopher was innocent. Also, while Christopher and his defense attorney talked, something changed. It seemed as though more information was coming to light. Official documents with the confession in its entirety were typed and completed by Detective Balaja. The date was March 19, 1989, and 1 month later, a year after Nancy was killed, authorities told the media that Richard was not the one who shot the gun that killed Nancy. It was Christopher. He had confessed. So now, the prosecution would only be trying Richard before a grand jury on the sexual-related charges. On April 26th, a grand jury indicted Richard. On May 5th, Christopher pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in a plea deal that would have him receive life in prison without parole and not face the murder charge if he testified against Richard. Richard Danzinger's trial began on January 22nd, 1990. Richard pled not guilty. The star witness was his former roommate and friend, Christopher Okoa. The DA prosecuting the case was Claire Dawson, and she told Nancy's mother not to be in court that day. She didn't want her to hear the brutality that her poor daughter faced. But Jeanette told her, "You don't understand. I have to. I can't live without knowing what they did to my baby." So she stayed and listened as Christopher took the stand. I pulled up part of this transcript, and I was shocked. It's just so horrible, and I can't even share everything because it's not only disrespectful, you could use your imagination, but I'm certainly not permitted to say it on this platform. It started with what we already know, that on October 23rd, Richard and Christopher went to Donna's. They drank and played some games. Richard wanted money, Christopher didn't want to do it. Richard had a whole plan with Roger and Donna as their allies. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Roger came over, and he and Christopher drove both their cars to their apartment instead of Roger and Christopher taking the same car. Christopher only slept an hour before he committed the crimes against Nancy. Christopher and Richard went in with the key. They demanded that Nancy open the safe and give them the money, which she did. But this is where the story changes. When Richard decided they needed to kill Nancy, they had already gagged her. Then they brought her to the hall near the bathrooms, the area where the video games are, where people normally waited on their pizzas, and they threw her on the bench. They tied her hands behind her back. Christopher said that Richard then unzipped his pants and, let's just say, he was doing something to himself that was really inappropriate while telling Nancy he was going to bone her. Then Richard forced her to kneel down, handed Christopher the gun, and told Christopher to kill her. Christopher got behind her, had the gun in his left hand, and had his right hand on her right shoulder. Christopher said that she was begging for him not to hurt her, saying, "Please don't, please don't." He said he pulled the trigger and shot her in the back of the head. Then she slumped forward, and when he let her go, her body fell face first onto the tile floor. That's when Christopher said he asked himself, "What have I done?" Then Christopher said they took her into the women's bathroom, and he pointed to where it is on a diagram so the jury could see. The prosecutor asked how they got her in there, and he said they dragged her. Christopher said he held the door open, and Richard picked her up from the shoulders and dragged her inside. They had previously gagged her, and at this point, Richard took that gag from her mouth. Christopher said he just yanked it off and proceeded to have intercourse with her down there, and also in her mouth. Yeah, the prosecutor asked Christopher if Nancy was bleeding, and he said yes. But when he was asked if she was moving, he said no. At that point, they thought she was already dead. Wow, how cruel and how disgusting. After Richard was finished, he told Christopher it was his turn to have some fun with Nancy. At first, Christopher said he didn't want to do it, but that made Richard mad. He told Christopher, "You're going to do it." So he finally said all right, and he took his penis out of his pants. Richard said, "You're going to have some fun with her too." Christopher said he proceeded to put his penis into her vagina and ejaculated inside, then pulled it out. The prosecutor asked if Nancy was saying anything to them before she was killed, and Christopher said that Nancy was saying, "Please stop, don't." But Richard told him he wanted to tie her up and gag her, so they did, using a scarf. It made her beg for her life. That's when Nancy's mom became physically ill in the courtroom. She was so sick to her stomach, listening to how much her poor daughter suffered and what these nasty, vile men did to her. She had to leave the room and ran to the restroom to throw up. Back to Christopher's testimony. He said to clean up the scene, he wiped down all the countertops they had touched and helped Richard use the bathroom water to wash Nancy's body and erase as much evidence as possible. Then they wiped down the restroom. They used a blue apron to stop up the sink drain and left the water running to cover their tracks. Christopher gave the money to Richard, and together they left in separate vehicles. Then Christopher said on November 9th, the night they visited the Arlie Pizza Hut, Richard and Christopher were at Donna's house again. They had been drinking wine and hanging out when Richard said he'd been at that location that day. Apparently, while he was at work at a different location, his boss had asked him to bring some checks over there. At that point, Richard asked Christopher, "Hey, do you want to go over there and see it?" Christopher said he just wanted to go home, but Richard convinced him. Christopher admitted he could be a bit gullible at times, so they drove over to the Pizza Hut anyway. That's when they sat down, ordered a beer, and Richard told Christopher that he recognized the security guard and the manager. Christopher didn't want to be there. You already know what happened. They walked over to the security guard and started making some weird comments and questions about the murder. After this, they went home. You know the rest. Polano and Bala both testified for the prosecution, saying that Christopher was shaken up during his interview, but Richard was calm and couldn't be intimidated. Donna also testified against her boyfriend Richard. She said the night before the murder, Christopher and Richard were talking while she was ironing in the kitchen, so she couldn't hear them. They could have talked about anything. At 11 p.m., her friend arrived, and they played a drinking game. Richard and Christopher left for a few minutes and said Christopher's car key was broken. At 2 a.m., they called Roger to come pick Christopher up. Roger showed up, stayed for a drink, and then Donna was drunk enough that she lost track of time. Roger and Christopher left at some point together. The next day, she said she woke up to the phone ringing, and Richard was the one who answered the phone, not Donna. It was Donna's supervisor asking why the store wasn't open. Donna and Richard started getting ready for work around 9:15. Donna actually had children, and as Richard's supervisor, it was her role to pick up the slack. So it was a mad dash for her to get her 2 kids ready to leave. When Donna got in her car, she realized that the front seat was pushed back more than usual. It indicated to her that someone else had been driving her car, but she said the keys were on their hook as usual when she woke up at 9:15. After she dropped her kids off, she and Richard arrived at Pizza Hut that morning after 10 a.m. at a different location, and nothing was unusual about the rest of the day. But when the two of them heard that Nancy had died, Richard looked at her and said, "I was with you, right?" Donna wasn't so sure. She had a lot to drink and was a heavy sleeper. It was possible that Richard could have taken her car between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., and she wouldn't have even known it. A corrections officer who worked at the Travis County Jail also testified against Richard. He said that on April 25th, Christopher was helping him serve dinner to other inmates when Richard said, "That's the mother effer that squealed on me." He then threw his drink in Christopher's face, and they started to get into a fight. The corrections officer had to get between them and separate them. On the other hand, Richard's defense said the only evidence connecting him to Nancy's murder was a pubic hair that looked similar to his. This wasn't concrete evidence. Hair comparison isn't an exact science. Richard testified on his own behalf. He sat there in front of this huge crowd wearing a bulletproof vest and said he'd been at Donna's the entire night and the morning when the crime occurred. Jeanette was sitting in the crowd, and she was irate. Richard was just staring at her the entire time, adamant that he had not seen Nancy that morning and that he would never do anything to her. He said the cops were lying and Christopher was lying. Jeanette felt sick that he was maintaining his innocence when there was so much circumstantial evidence against him. Why would the seat of Donna's car be pushed back? Why would Richard know about a .22 caliber gun and a blue apron? After deliberating for 3 hours, the jury found Richard guilty on February 1st. The next day, at a sentencing trial, they decided in 7.5 minutes that Richard would receive a life sentence. One of the jurors, Liz Rowland, was interviewed, and she said that of course, she believed what Christopher told everyone, and she believed they deserved the sentence they were going to get. The jury was being congratulated for putting them behind bars. Nancy's parents, Jeanette and Eddie, felt completely relieved that after 15 months the judicial system worked. Richard was going to jail. But Jeanette reminded the public that this trial was about getting justice for Nancy, and she didn't want Nancy to be remembered by Richard speaking for himself. She wanted people to remember how beautiful Nancy was and how much she loved her family. The week afterward, Christopher Ochoa was sentenced to life in prison for capital murder. The case seemed finished, but in the next few years, more evidence would come out. Bear with me, because this information is wild. That is why I wanted to cover this case. It already seems so unbelievable. Well, you just wait. I know that it's hard with so much information, but I'm telling you, your patience will pay off. This case will stick with you. Let me take you 6 years after Richard and Christopher were put behind bars. Investigator Manny Fuentes was assigned to investigate some very strange letters that were being sent all over the place from a Texas inmate. He was a really bad guy, already serving 3 life sentences for sex crimes and armed robberies. The letters were full of crazy ramblings, which is actually pretty common. There are lots of bored inmates with nothing better to do with their time. This inmate's name was Joseph Marino, and he had apparently been sending letters to different politicians, police stations, and investigators for years. On February 17, 1998, he wrote a letter to George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas at the time. He received this 4-page handwritten letter that month. This guy was one of the worst. He was sexist, racist, and had a long criminal history. I'm not going to go into it all, but he really wasn't someone that most of us, especially a governor, would give the time of day to. But Detective Fuentes was tasked with giving him his time. I have this letter. I went through it word by word. It starts with the subject line, "Murder Confession." That should get anyone's attention. Then it reads, "Dear Governor Bush, "Sir, my name is Akim Joseph Marino," and then he gives his inmate number and where he's currently confined. He writes that he's serving 3 life sentences plus 3 10-year sentences for crimes committed in Austin, Texas, in both 1988 and 1990. Then he goes on to say that while in Austin in 1988, he also robbed and sexually violated a 20-year-old woman at the Pizza Hut on Arley Lane. This was in late October of 1988 after purchasing the murder weapon via the Austin American-Statesman classified section. The woman's name was Nancy Lena DePriest. I have not been convicted for this crime. I was arrested in El Paso, Texas, where the murder weapon was confiscated by the El Paso Police Department. However, the federal government convicted me on other charges and not Nancy's murder. Apparently, he had now gone through a religious transformation after attending Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous programs in prison. He wanted to come clean about being responsible for Nancy's murder. He said, "I'm 100% responsible." As Detective Fuentes was looking into this, he was told many times by the Austin PD that he was wasting his time. All he had to do was look at Christopher Ochoa's confession. The guys who really did this were already in jail, and he should just ignore this lunatic who was writing these absurd letters. But just to be sure, Fuentes went to visit Christopher in prison that same year, but Christopher absolutely refused to speak to him. His first words were, "I have nothing to say, just let me do my time." It seemed like his colleagues were right, he was wasting his time. But there was something about all this that just seemed off. For one thing, back in 1992, 2 years after both men had been on trial, Detective Polano, remember him, was fired. He had been accused of coercing false confessions and lying on the witness stand, not in Christopher and Richard's trial, but in enough other cases that it was clear he wasn't reliable, and neither was his shoddy police work. Someone had caught him on video beating up a suspect. I mean, if he did this once, there's a strong possibility he'd done it again. Polano faced charges and was then exonerated. Was videotaped violence not enough to convict him? I don't know. I guess not, because Polano went right back to his job, and by 1998, he was still serving on the force. However, this raised Fuentes' suspicions. He wanted to use his own skills to reanalyze this case from scratch, so he went back to square one. Was it true what Akim said in his letter, that Christopher and Richard were basically arrested for a crime that he committed? Fuentes pulled up Nancy's case files and started examining all the photos taken at the crime scene. He pored over the evidence piece by piece and noticed a few things. One was the shell casing found in the bathroom where Nancy's body had been found. She was not in the hallway where Christopher stated that he shot her, and neither was the shell casing. Why would Christopher move the shell casing to the bathroom? Had it somehow made its way there on its own? It didn't seem likely. Plus, there was something even more telling. The blood spatter. Upon further investigation, Fuentes noticed there was a bucket in the bathroom that had high-velocity blood stains on it, which meant it was nearby when Nancy was shot. So, she was shot in the bathroom, not the hallway. The stains on the hallway wall were not consistent. They were low-velocity stains, most likely from when emergency personnel were trying to either attend to her, or move her, or revive her. That's when Fuentes decided he might be onto something. He went back to Akim's letter, now looking at it with more confidence that it might lead him in the right direction. He called the El Paso PD and referenced the case regarding Akim from 1988. It happened only 2 days after Nancy's murder, and unbelievably, they still had the gun in evidence. He requested it and brought it in for forensic testing. It was also a .22 caliber, the same caliber of bullet recovered from Nancy's head. However, Fuentes dug deeper into Akim's letter, and there was something that stood out. Akim claimed that at the time of his arrest, he literally had the keys to the Pizza Hut in his possession, as well as 2 bank bags with the names of the Pizza Hut and the bank on them. These items were put into his personal property locker in the county jail when he was being processed, and that's crazy to me. Clearly, if you look at these items, they're evidence from a crime. They're not a wallet or personal in nature. But okay, so Occam said these items stayed there for 14 months until his friend Janet Vaugh, for whom he provided an address, picked up all his personal property when he was finally transferred to prison. He said she took it all to his parents' house, where it remained until the day he was paroled in 1990. But he was rearrested for another offense, and that was when his cellmate told him that 2 men had confessed to NY's murder, which just baffled him. He told his cellmate they had the wrong guys. Now, he didn't admit that he did it, but he said he knew the guy who did this, and that was before his spiritual awakening. The letter went on to explain that he had written to the Texas District Attorney's Office multiple times since 1996, and every single letter had been ignored. That is when he wrote to Bush, but the governor's office didn't get back to him either. I mean, at this point, Bush was most likely trying to prepare to run for president, so maybe he was just a little busy. But I know it can take months before you get a response, if you get one at all. Months and months passed, and Akim never got a response, but he never gave up. Akim wrote again, this time to the police. He said in that letter that if they went to his house, they would find all the evidence involved in the crime. This included the bank bags and the handcuffs that had been used to restrain Nancy. But the Austin Police Department was skeptical. Here was this random guy writing them from prison, claiming he was responsible for a case they'd solved years ago. But now that Fuentes was on the case, he sent an officer to Achim's parents' house, and they were able to find everything he had promised. The .22 caliber bullets, the bank bag, which held exactly $150 that was missing from the safe, and a pair of handcuffs, which were sent to the crime lab for DNA testing. What I told you is crazy, but it didn't automatically mean they believed Akim. He could have been involved in the crime with Christopher and Richard. Maybe they made some kind of deal. But the letter had already stated that he was the only one responsible, and he didn't know these other guys. Nevertheless, the Austin PD tried to make a connection. They looked and looked for one. Jail phone records, mail, shared cellmates, but there was nothing. So Fuentes decided to speak with Achim himself. He was brought to the Austin Police Department for an interview. Achim was calm and confident, and he told a very compelling story. He said that on the morning of October 24th, 1988, he was looking for a restaurant to rob. He went around randomly, looking for ones that only had one car in the parking lot before opening hours. That way, there would most likely only be one person inside. He dressed like a repairman, carrying a toolbox and everything, pretending he was there to fix something. That was his ruse. Well, he admits that he first stopped at a restaurant up the street from Pizza Hut called Magic Time Machine. A man came to the door and actually let him inside, but he aborted the mission. He was hoping to find a woman inside alone. He was on a mission. He was seeking revenge on a woman from his past who was white with blonde hair, a security guard that he felt had wronged him. He had promised himself if he found someone that resembled her that day, he would blow her head off. Well, sadly, he found one when he stopped at Pizza Hut. He used the same ruse, and it worked with Nancy. She let him in, and he followed her to the back just as the phone rang. He let her answer it, but as soon as she was done, he asked her to come over to the beverage area because he needed to show her something. That's when he pulled out his gun and told her this was a robbery and to give him all the money in the safe, which she did. Then he forced her at gunpoint into the men's restroom, where he told her to take off all of her clothes. She complied, and he tied her hands behind her back with her bra and made her go back to the storage area, where he confessed to violating her only one time. Before he told her to go back to the men's room, he explained to her that he was going to handcuff her to the plumbing and leave her to be found later. Sadly, when she kneeled down to be handcuffed to the pipe under the sink, Akim said he shot her in the back of the head. She had no idea he was going to do it. She hadn't seen it coming. It was quick, and she didn't beg for her life or say anything. When it was all over, he said that he searched for the shell casing, but in haste, he couldn't find it and didn't want to spend any more time there, so he left it behind and fled. This was a lot to take in, but Fuentes decided to check out the Magic Time Machine story. Sure enough, the manager at the time, Oscar Salas, said that a man did come by that morning. He let him in, he went to the back of the building, and then he just left without saying a word. This was all adding up. Had they had this information from the beginning, they probably wouldn't have believed Christopher and Richard, but this meant that they lied about everything. Why? On top of all this, it turns out George Bush's office admitted that Bush had received this letter. They only ignored it because he claimed that the district attorney's office had been notified. As for why the DA didn't do anything with this evidence, maybe it got lost, but it's unlikely. The state probably didn't want to admit that they had gotten the wrong guys. I mean, that's taking a big hit to admit you got it wrong. After this, Christopher was visited by investigators, but he thought they were going to accuse him of another crime and force another confession. He was afraid that if he said he was innocent, then he would be seen as not having any remorse for Nancy, and the parole board would never consider him for release. They asked him if he was innocent, and he said no, that he and Richard were responsible. But Christopher started to have some hope. In June of 1999, he wrote a letter to the Wisconsin Innocence Project, which took on his case. At this point, the Texas authorities were looking into the case and hoping to actually exonerate both Christopher and Richard. I know I've only been talking about Christopher, and there's a reason for that. Unfortunately, Richard wasn't exactly able to speak with detectives the way that Christopher was, because back on February 27, 1991, less than a year after being incarcerated, Richard was attacked in prison. Another inmate misidentified him as someone they knew, and they tried to kill him. He was kicked in the head multiple times. It was brutal. Richard was taken to the hospital, where he underwent surgery, and they had to remove part of his brain. At 4 a.m., his parents got the call from a chaplain telling them Richard was in the ICU and probably wouldn't make it, that he might only have days to live. But he survived. However, after such a traumatic event, he had permanent brain damage and could not even take care of himself. Surprisingly, he was put back into general population in prison, where he was consistently taken advantage of. He was beaten. He was tortured in many ways that I don't even want to mention. But I'm sure you know what they did to him. He was just rotting away for something he possibly had no involvement in. By the year 2000, DNA technology had advanced a lot, so they took DNA samples from Akeem in August of that year. At this point, 12 years had passed, and though DNA processing takes a while, it was a lot more accurate than it used to be. Multiple labs tested the semen samples found at the crime scene, as well as the hair, and they compared it to Christopher and Richard. Again, they were not a match. Christopher and Richard were exonerated. The semen samples didn't match up either. Recall, Christopher's was never really a match, it just couldn't be eliminated. Well, it turns out there were 3 million other people that shared that genetic marker, and the hair did not belong to Richard. As for Occam, his DNA was a match. He was the killer. When the news broke, as you can probably imagine, it was very shocking. Detective Polanco retired. He's the true villain in the story. I mean, I cannot believe that he got away with beating people in interviews, promising they would get the death penalty, and calling himself the devil. Usually law enforcement is on the side of justice, but sometimes these things happen. Not only Nancy and her family were victims of this crime, but Richard and Christopher and their families were too. I understand that it's hard to believe, but people do confess to crimes they did not commit. False confessions are more common than you may think. But didn't Christopher know things about the crime scene? His confession was so detailed. Well, let's remember it was being typed by the investigators, not Christopher, and it wasn't recorded in any way. Christopher said that his confession included intimate details of the crime scene because officers showed him pictures before he made a statement. But that's not all. Christopher explained everything, and it began to make sense. As I briefly explained, he was never in trouble with the law. As a matter of fact, he respected law enforcement. He had the utmost respect for police. He remembers them coming to his school when he was a kid and telling children if they were ever in trouble, they could rely on the cops. Just call 911. Christopher was a good student. He came from a close-knit family, and was looking forward to going to community college for 2 years and then transferring to the University of Austin. But he didn't come from money, so he was working at Pizza Hut to save up. He believed the cops were on his side when they brought him in. He had no idea they were considering him a suspect. He was just trying to help. Christopher completely trusted that law enforcement had his best interests in mind, not understanding that they wanted a confession. Polanco and Balaja claimed that they used interview tactics that were commonplace. They weren't doing anything extreme. They were just playing good cop, bad cop to draw a confession out of someone who engaged in sketchy behaviors. But Christopher said he felt trapped. Polanco started yelling and threatening him, telling him he would be executed. We know that Polanco may have been successful at getting confessions, but he wasn't ethical. At one point, Christopher said he asked the woman detective if he could have an attorney, and she said he couldn't have one until he was officially charged, which was a lie. Now maybe Christopher misunderstood what was being said, but knowing that they were using extreme and unethical interview tactics, and that Polanco had a track record of finishing his cases quickly, I kinda have a feeling that the cops were probably in the wrong during this interview. They only cared about getting Christopher to break down. No matter how they got to that result, it wasn't working on Richard, so they went harder on Christopher. Physically too, Polanco allegedly grabbed Christopher's arm and pointed to the spot where veins are located, saying, "This is where the needle's going to go in when they execute you." Polanco said he would be there to watch Christopher's execution. Christopher told them time and time again he didn't do anything, and he begged them to believe him. Many times Polanco was right in his face, enough to smell his breath and feel his spit. He threatened him that he was going to call the DA and charge him with capital murder, and that's when he finally asked them, "What do I have to do to go home?" Polanco said Christopher needed to just make a statement, so that's when Boardman came in and had Christopher sign a blank piece of paper so they could put anything on it that they wanted to, because they already had Christopher's signature. At that point, he didn't know what to believe. He was scared, and from everything that he learned, he thought Richard had killed Nancy. He couldn't believe his best friend would do something so horrible. At one point, he said they tried to record his interview on tape, but Polanco was having trouble. He had to stop the tape anytime Christopher gave an answer he didn't like, so he got too frustrated to continue. That's when they brought in the typewriter. He wanted it to stop, he wanted to go home, so he complied. When his mother, Dora, heard the news, she was heartbroken and confused. No one in his family thought he was capable of something like this. They did not believe it. But as time went on, and things were looking worse for Christopher, especially when his own attorney explained to him that it was best he just took a plea deal to get a lesser sentence, his mom agreed. At one point, Christopher found out she almost had a heart attack and was in the hospital, and he didn't want her to worry, so he took the deal because she had been begging him to do that. Who knows who really came up with everything that was heard at trial? It had been drilled into Christopher. He thought at that point, when even his lawyer gave up on him, this was all he had. When he was initially confessing, he actually thought that once he got a lawyer, they'd smooth it over, or the real evidence would come out at trial. Texas prisons are really tough, and nobody wanted to listen to Christopher. He kept saying he was innocent. At one point, he said he wanted to die. He wrote a letter to his uncle Ronald, and his family was just praying that he wouldn't do anything to himself. His mom said she prayed every day and begged him not to take his life. The truth was that when Christopher found out what happened to Nancy, he was horrified. He couldn't believe that happened to someone who worked at one of the Pizza Huts. But he actually didn't know Nancy personally, and neither did Richard. They were young kids who were morbidly curious, like many others, and they wanted to check out the scene where it happened. They were toasting in her memory, in honor of her, because they did something to her that was misinterpreted. And that's all it took. Christopher was released from prison in January 2000 after 12 years of being behind bars. 2 months later, Richard was released to the care of his family, but sadly, because of the subdural hematoma, he would never again have the quality of life he had before he went to jail. He needed to be cared for by someone else for the rest of his life. However, both Christopher and Richard received multi-million-dollar settlements from Travis County and the city of Austin for their wrongful convictions. I want to know, do you think that makes up for what they went through? There are a lot of opinions on this case. That's the reason I wanted to do this story. I've seen so many comments all over the internet talking about how Christopher deserved to be imprisoned for the rest of his life because he testified against Richard, knowing it was a lie. People think that should be a crime in and of itself, and he was ultimately responsible by extension for Richard's situation. What do you think? I see their point, but we have to remember that Christopher went through 20 hours of interrogation. That's not easy, especially for someone with English as a second language. It's hard to say whether he even confessed at all. It was Polanco and Balaja putting words in his mouth and then typing statements themselves. Even Nancy's mother has forgiven Christopher and Richard, but especially Christopher. Not right away, though. She probably felt like many of the people I just referenced, who truly seemed to have hatred toward Christopher. Jeanette found out through her family that Christopher and Richard's convictions were overturned. She had just gotten married and was at work when she received a phone call from her brother-in-law telling her to turn on the TV. She turned on the TV at work, and there was a Texas district attorney saying that Acom was Nancy's murderer. Jeanette actually collapsed. She was livid. She was so mad they hadn't called her. All the feelings of devastation and grief boiled up again. She called the DA's office and argued with one of the assistants, insisting that they already had the right people and now they were letting them go. Then she called Christopher and Richard's lawyers. Both of them acted defensive, but Jeanette insisted she didn't care what the verdict was. She just wanted the truth. Well, the truth was they made a mistake. They told Jeanette that the two men were innocent. Jeanette, of course, couldn't call Richard, but she did call Christopher. She talked to him in prison and apologized to him and his family for all the suffering they went through. Of course, it wasn't Jeanette's fault, but she, like a lot of other people, believed the Texas judicial system was fair. But then she realized sometimes it's not. On January 16, 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the convictions of Christopher and Richard. Jeanette attended the hearings, and when Christopher walked free, she pulled him aside and asked, "Why did you confess?" He said that in that confession room there was no food, no water, no sunlight, and no hope, and it broke him. He didn't have the courage to defend himself and his friend, and the guilt ate him alive. Jeanette now wanted to find out what actually happened. She went to visit Akim in prison. There she asked, "Why did you kill Nancy?" He told her that he had heard voices in his head since he was a child, and these voices were telling him to make a human sacrifice. He said she didn't fight him. Nancy was turned away and would have never seen the bullet coming. Jeanette was outraged that she and her family had spent years thinking Nancy had begged for her life for over an hour, as two perpetrators tried to take away her dignity time and time again. Jeanette had reoccurring nightmares about the amount of pain Nancy must have been in, but now knowing that this story had been created and exaggerated by police, where is the justice? What happened to Nancy was horrible, but Jeanette still felt a tiny bit of relief, knowing that not everything that happened occurred the way she thought it had. When the DA's office asked Jeanette if she wanted to pursue the death penalty for Akim, she refused. She didn't want Akim's blood on her hands. In fact, Jeanette spent the rest of her life as an activist advocating against the death penalty. She converted to Catholicism and believed that a life for a life is not justice. Justice is having to sit and suffer for your consequences the rest of your life. And I want to know what you think of the death penalty. It's definitely a polarizing topic. You're welcome to come to whatever conclusion you want about Christopher's innocence or guilt in all of this, but at the very least, I do try my best to have empathy and understanding, which I know isn't easy. But Christopher did lose years of his own life, and he said, "Sometimes I think about Richard, and I feel very bad because I didn't have the courage to face up to whoever might come to me so that he wouldn't go to prison. I want to mention that, but in the settlements, Richard received over $10 million, and Christopher received $5 million. He gave a big portion of his payout to Richard and his family. But of course, the damage was already done. Remember that juror I told you about? When they found out, they felt awful about being a part of all this. But she admitted that the evidence was very convincing, and the DA even made a statement. She said she truly had no reason not to believe Christopher and the confession. She would have never prosecuted him if she had any doubt, but she wasn't armed with everything we know now. I wonder how many cases like this exist. The Texas Rangers began investigating Sergeant Borman, Balaja, and Polanco for their role in Christopher's false confession. The investigators didn't follow up on leads in the first days of their search. They didn't interview all of the witnesses, which is why we didn't get testimony from Pizza Hut bosses like Donna's supervisor. They had already jumped to conclusions and formed their own story, and there was little to no documentation of any of these interviews. Finally, in closing, Christopher's confession included a ton of details that police knew were wrong. They never corrected him in his confession. He did say several things that only the police or the perpetrator would know, but that's because he was fed all of that information. Unfortunately, because nobody had documented Polanco and Balaja's good cop, bad cop routine, the investigation into their misconduct was unable to be determined. They couldn't tell whether Christopher was intimidated into giving a confession, and none of these detectives got into trouble. Akim's trial was in October of 2022, and he pleaded not guilty by insanity, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He was sentenced to life in prison, on top of the 3 other life sentences for the murder of Nancy DePriest. After all this, Christopher actually went to law school at the University of Wisconsin, where he is now an attorney. In 2006, he and Jeanette testified in California that all police interrogations should be videotaped. Jeanette said, "I've heard lots of people say I would never do that. I would never confess to something I didn't do. How do you know what you would do if you were in that interrogation room with the man they call El Diablo?" False confessions happen all the time, not only from people suffering from mental illness or vulnerability, but people like Christopher, who are intelligent and have good intentions. As for Nancy, her daughter Slivia is now in her late 30s. Sadly, Jeanette passed away in 2019 at 69 years old after her battle with lung cancer, and Richard died in 2021 following his own battle with cancer at age 50. Todd and the rest of the family are left with their memories of Nancy, the hardworking, dedicated, sweet, funny, and bright young woman that she was. It hurts me that so many people suffered due to negligence and the choices of an absolute monster. But I have hope, knowing that people like Nancy exist, and we can honor their stories and remember them for who they were before their lives were robbed from them.